I've got 7:57 here, so we
Oh,
post
3 minutes?
PM.
All right, we can do the pre-meeting ramble, a little chatter.
Yeah.
All right. So for those who have logged in already and are viewing this, the 57 participants, when you are asking questions, we do ask that folks put them into the chat window. They'll pop up. We can see them there and we can address any questions you have. We may hit those questions further on in the presentation, so we don't answer them right away. We may get to them down the road. So I don't think we're ignoring you. We will just get there eventually. We're going to try to keep the flow going pretty well. We can talk about Steelhead for ages, and we do in the shop. It's one of the biggest topics, especially come September, October, November, December, and into spring as well. Folks start getting geared up for Steelhead season way earlier too, in July and August, getting their stuff together. So really, it's a great thing to discuss and offer some clarity on some aspects of steelheading as well. So lots in the works for today, and huge interest in it right now because, well, it's one of the best things to do outside and safely. So we can definitely, help you guys get into fish, understand what the fish do, and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, we timed this pretty well actually, because I think proper steelhead season is really just about to get going this weekend for a lot of folks. So
yeah, there are some earlier runs and success early on too for you, Chris. And but you're right. Historically, October, November, November, December is definitely when steelhead does pick up for many rivers as well. So I think you're right. Great timing for this.
Yeah, right on time as far as temperatures go. We just finally had that big break this week. So if people have been out to this point, maybe gotten a little discouraged by just how warm it was, and a lot of rivers were pretty low despite the rain. This really should be a big kickoff here. So hopefully we can help you. As I say, this is designed to be more than anything a Q&A for you guys. So don't hold back on the questions. We've got some stuff planned here, but the more questions, the better. I think we did say that we would try and avoid like hyper personal specific questions. I think it's fair to ask like hypotheticals on fishing conditions and like how to approach a certain scenario, but maybe we aren't going to dig into, how long a leader should I use on this rod kind of thing. But by all means, gear and fish related questions, whatever, I think it's fair game. So yeah, pop them down the chat, and the more we have to work with, the better, I think.
Yep, absolutely. And Chris is right for those questions. If you're looking for like a specific like line for a rod, Skagit head or sing tip or anything like that, a center pin setup, you can ask us all those questions back at the shop. Call us tomorrow, email us, get to hold us through social media as well. Tonight we're going to give as much information as we can to as many as we can, and then anything specific we can address down the road, personally.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, Rob, we just got a couple last second requests to join on Instagram there. I'm not sure if you're able to shoot that along.
Yep, I have the phone. Yep, absolutely. I have the rocking right here. So I'm shooting those along just now. Right on. Perfect. Cool. All right, we're 8:01, so I guess we can definitely start and get going. So, all right, well, welcome to it. Welcome to How We Fish Great Lakes Steelhead. This whole series we're putting together is about how we fish and how we approach water. And the seasonality, you're talking about lots of things in terms of steelheading. So I want to bring this at you because we can't bring you guys on the river right now. We don't have any sort of guiding or instruction taking place. So, and this is a great way to reach the masses and really dispel tons of myths about steelheading. We've definitely found that these fish are regaled as being this mysterious, fish in the rivers when they're really rainbow trout that migrate from freshwater to freshwater. So they're looking at a particular Great Lakes steelhead we can talk about. Looking at gear, looking at techniques, looking at flies to use, looking at all those fun things. We can dissect these fish and get super nerdy, but we'll try to keep things that are pretty sort of, mid-level or so. We're not going to go over the, not going to skim over many things. We definitely talk about things in quite good detail and get you guys on the water. We'll talk about where to find fish, how to find fish, how we even approach a new river as well. So we'll jump on Apple Maps or Google Earth or Google Images for satellite imagery, and we'll even show you guys how to utilize that. Looking at the Water Office website too. It's a government website that gives you real-time monitoring of river flows. So you're able to really find out what's happening on river that's maybe a couple 100 kilometers away. So by the time you get there, it's you're in a great place to to view and to fish well.
You had some slides you kind of wanted to kick things off, like a very basic intro to what we're dealing with here.
Yep, absolutely going to jump to that, and we will go through some basic things like biology as well, what these fish are. And Chris, thanks for reminding me about those slides there. So I'll pop these up. And one thing I'd love to go out and really talk about first is like what these fish are and how they differ from what we hear as West Coast steelhead. Those are fish that are going from salt water to freshwater. There's a particular name for those fish, and there's a particular name for the fish that go from freshwater to freshwater as well. So we don't have the, again, I always screw the name up, but they're anadromous fish. There we go, anadromous fish. Those are the ones that go from saltwater to the freshwater, and then some of the freshwater spawning back to the saltwater, or just maybe a terminal spawner like salmon, which head up the river and then they breed and they die. Now the fish that we have here, I believe they're potted ramus or something towards that effect, where they go from freshwater to freshwater. So they're born in freshwater, they leave and go stay in freshwater, and they return to freshwater to breed. So they're not the same fish in terms of characteristics as the West Coast. Now, a lot of folks do refer to these fish as rainbow trout. They are exactly rainbow trout. They call them rainbows, go out for trout. In the shop, we really like to differentiate and talk about Great Lake steelhead and just for the basic fact, these fish tend to be much, much, much larger. So when folks come in, someone can say, "Oh, well, I'm going for trout this weekend." Okay, great. Well, here's your 4-weight. Here's a couple of flies, some small pheasant tails, some dry flies. They find out they're going for migratory rainbows or Great Lake steelhead, and that's a completely different gear set in terms of terminal tackle, the rod and reel, and things like that. So having that differentiation, so going from rainbow trout, calling them Great Lake steelhead, migratory mangrove trout to Great Lake steelhead, that's a big differentiation. So in terms of what we see here, in terms of like their forage base is quite different. In the lake, you're eating emerald shiners, alley wife, goby, salmon will eat those things as well. They don't stick in the tributaries for too long, like about a year and a half for a lot of the tributaries. So they really don't get a ton of time in the estuaries or in the tributaries to grow. The West Coast, you have maybe more sterile rivers. They don't have as much food in them. You also have very cold rivers too, so it really limits the growth of these fish. And if you're looking at the aggressiveness of some fish and wanting to take a dry fly, for example, the West Coast fish can be in the river for up to 6 years as a smolt, and really imparting that surface feeding behavior that differentiates a lot of fish to eat on the surface when they're adults as well. 6 years of doing something versus a year and a half. So we have some pretty big differences in terms of the fish that we do have in our fresh coast, if you want to call it that. We have a lot of fish in our Great Lakes that are stocked, but also a lot of fish that are wild reproducing as well. We often hear that, these fish are just stocked fish. Well, they were stocked fish, many of them, but at this point, there's a ton of wild reproduction and natural reproduction especially on the Lake Ontario side or Canadian side of Lake Ontario, and through the northern Superior tributaries, and also Lake Huron tributaries too. There's a fair amount of natural reproduction as well. So they're not just all stocked fish. They were stocked, they've naturalized. They are non-native fish, and we definitely admit that these are fish that were stocked here that are non-native from the West Coast, and they're put here. Now, when we look at stocking and look at wild fish, there's some really upsides to producing wild fish and having those fish spawn successfully. Those fish have way better genetics. They survive disasters better. They are more robust fish. They've learned how to survive in our waterways, and they've really developed a skill set and an ability to navigate a lot more things than hatchery raised fish. In terms of genetics too, they've gone through a natural selection process. I believe even like their brain activity as well. I believe it was like Larry Halleck at a Trout Unlimited meeting, or someone else at the meeting, a biologist there was saying there's a study done, and they actually studied the brain activity of a trout, a stocked trout or a pen-raised trout versus a wild trout, and even like the neurons firing, the brain activity was so much bigger in terms of, or larger in terms of the wild fish than the stocked fish. So looking at fish that are grabbier, more alert, more active versus a pen-raised thing. So quite great. A fish that grew up in a river, they have to be better hunters essentially. They have to go out there and forage for their food and find food versus being fed pellets. So there's some different characterizations of fish, wild versus stocked fish. I think the biggest thing coming out in the news these days, and in terms of the science, is that the negative health effects on environments with stockfish. So when we look at introducing watered down genetics, looking at introducing fish from hatcheries that might have some sort of maybe disease to them as well. So looking at what's better for the environment overall, stockfish are not exactly the best option. They were the best option to put fish somewhere, but using stocking programs to bring back a fish from near extirpation or restocking fish that was extinct, those are programs that do work. But if you have wild fish, putting stockfish over wild fish dilutes those genetics. What we should be doing instead is enhancing the environment and protecting those fish versus putting more fish on top of those fish. So a bit of a rundown, bit of a spiel there for you guys. Something that I'm pretty passionate about too is letting fish breed naturally and having that robust genetics in our ecosystem. All right, hit the next slide. Let's see if we can move on here. A lot of folks ask when fish do hit the rivers. That's a great question. We have a fall run of fish and also fish in the spring that come in as well. The fish that run in the fall, generally speak, they stay in the system until spring. So we have a lot of fish that hold over the winter and then a ton of fish in the spring. Fish really do start entering the system in some areas as in like late August, a couple of fish will trickle in. Very, very few. The water is quite warm, so we don't suggest folks target those fish. As we get into September and October, you have more fish come in, and then really the runs really do pick up for a lot of fisheries through November and into December. Some rivers historically fish way better in November and December than October, and some of them are later runs type of thing. So it's definitely sort of up in the air when fish do come in. There's also factors in terms of water flows, water temperatures, all sorts of cues for those fish. Even photo periods play into getting fish to run as well. So when people were talking about getting into steelhead season and where you can fish, there are certain areas you can and cannot fish. The general trout season in Zone 16 in Southern Ontario is closed as of September 30th at midnight, but there are exceptions to those rules, which give us a ton of angling opportunities. So if you're not familiar with the rivers you are going to fish on, take a few minutes, hit the regulation book and find out exactly where you can and cannot go. That's super critical to make sure that you're on the right side of the law. You're not going to get any fines, and those fish that are protected in those closed areas stay protected, so they're able to spawn and sort of keep our populations going as well. Now, as I ramble there, are there any questions that are popping up at the moment? Let me see here. Nothing new. Okay, great, awesome. Fantastic. So in terms of timing of runs, we're looking at a few things here for runs in terms of species. June through November, we're looking at Atlantic salmon. They'll come up the rivers. Well, Chris, I guess somehow you're muted. Give me a second here to unmute Chris. Sorry about that. Give me a second here to find him.
Sorry, I thought I would be helpful and mute myself so I didn't actually pop up on people's screens. And apparently you can't just selectively unmute yourself.
All right. Well, you're back. Fantastic. There we go.
Yeah, I just put a prompt up there in the chat for people to start dropping questions. I'll just keep, if you want to keep going through the slides, I'll keep a running list of questions.
Okay.
And then once we wind down the slides, then we can dive into it.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay. Excellent. So timing runs for Great Lakes in terms of other species as well. So we have a bit more knowledge too. Atlantic salmon, they do exist in the Great Lakes, or in particular in Lake Ontario, that's where they're being restocked. There are some in the St. Mary's Rapids. That's a fully stocked fishery up there. There's a university program that takes care of that. Very cool fishery. I've not been there yet, but plans to hopefully next year. Atlantic salmon, if they are in the Great Lakes, they are running, that's June through November. They come in quite early, even on the Gas Bay and the East Coast. You're looking at fish that run, June all the way, and they stay in the river all the way until the next year. So quite a long time they're in the river itself. Chinook salmon, they'll start in August, they go through October. By November, so the runs are pretty much done. Those fish have done their business and they've expired. Coho salmon tend to be a little later, even into November sometimes as well. Steelhead, September, you get a few fish in, as I mentioned. October, some more fish. November, December, way more fish. They overwinter, they stay in the rivers, and then even some fish stay all the way in through until June. The next slide here is a photo of a fish that I was caught fishing with a friend, Ian Troop. That was on June 1st of 2020. So awesome fish. The leaves are green behind me. The water was super cold. It was a heck of a fun fish. It was on fire. I was bombing downriver chasing this thing. It was a heck of a great time. So in terms of that, we have a great opportunity into June as long as the water temperature stays cold. That's the biggest caveat here is June, we could get some really hot rocking temperatures. And those fish wouldn't do very well being caught in over 20 degrees, even close to 20-degree temperatures at Celsius. So just be really, really careful about when you do target fish in the spring because of what can happen in terms of water temperatures and fish mortality. So where do fish run? Great question. We get this all the time. Like, where should I go fish? Essentially, every tributary of the Great Lakes will get a run of fish. Some get way, way more. Some get very few, a trickle. We have reports of some rivers near Kingston that get a handful of fish. I have no idea which rivers those are, and I think the numbers are so low that we wouldn't want to tell folks where they were anyways because they couldn't handle the angling pressure. If they are naturally producing, they need to do their thing and keep on going there. But you start to hit rivers like Wilmot Creek, you hit the Ganaraska, Dages Creek, and all the way going west along the Ontario side, and there's fish all the way from there going off to the Niagara River as well. And then the US side has a ton of fish too. It's a whole other presentation or topic on the US side, but we can fish a ton of rivers here up through the Georgian Bay area. There's the Beaver, the Big Head, a ton of little creeks and streams. And Nottawasaga is a very famous fishery and produces some fantastic fishing as well. Some great guides up there too. And also on the Huron side as well, the Saugeen, the Maitland, the Bayfield, a ton of rivers out there as well that you can hit. So there's a ton of rivers. Anything that runs into a Great Lake essentially has a run of fish, whether large or small. And those superior tributaries up north too. I've never been on them myself, but we have lots of reports of being pretty cool to check out. So hopefully down the road I can get up there and get those a spin as well.
There is one other noticeable kind of, if you want to call it a dead spot when it comes to those rivers too. Like you say, yeah, pretty well anything, certainly south and southwestern Ontario pretty well gets steelhead. Mm-hmm. A lot of those sort of more upper Georgian Bay rivers don't either. The stipulation would be that you really want some kind of cold water fishery like toward the upper reaches of those rivers. If you look at some of those Georgian Bay warm water fisheries, like say the Moon River or the Gibson River, places like that, Spanish River even, they just don't have that cold water. So anything sort of like Honey Harbor and north in around the Georgian Bay area won't really have steelhead either.
Yep, great point there, Chris, and absolutely a fantastic point on that. You may get a few strays up there, the random fish or two, but you're not going to get a really big population of fish that are going to run up there. I used to canoe a lot and canoe trip on the Gibson River. I've never saw a single steelhead up there or salmon that runs into the Georgian Bay area as well. So great point there. Right on. Something for everyone on this presentation is something that we're working on. It's accessible to everyone who's not even on the presentation right now, but we're looking at putting up not necessarily very particular river maps, but what they are going to be is highlighted areas where rivers do exist for you to go and explore. We'll eventually develop this into being what fish species are in there. Maybe general seasons on there as well. We're putting what we have as a accessibility rating in terms of what is publicly accessible water and what's mostly private. That's a lot of great information there because you don't want to end up at a river and then not be able to access that river as well. You get to, I don't know, maybe the upper Nottawasaga where there's a ton of private property and you can't really fish too well. Or access at all, maybe by the roadways, but not, sort of wading the riverbanks there. So we want to make sure that we're putting good information out there for you to be able to access these rivers. So down the pipe, jump on here, you can see which rivers to fish and get into that. Now, Chris, we can talk about the Water Office. We mentioned it before, but it's a fantastic website to use to help time runs. That's a massive thing in terms of looking at what rivers have enough water to fish, what rivers may be pulling fish into them. And Chris, let's what are your thoughts on using the site? How do you go about it?
Yeah, I think any kind of serious steelheader generally lives and dies by this site in Ontario. To some extent, there are other services out there and others that you may even prefer to use. Might give you similar info, but the Water Office is certainly the more sort of all-encompassing one when it comes to which rivers you can view on it. So yeah, if you want, I've got it up if you want me to do a screen share here.
Sure, if you want to jump on that, Chris, absolutely.
I think I can do a screen share. Let me see on that actually, since I'm not a co-host. Let's see. Oh yeah, I can. Oh no, you've disabled participant screen sharing, so can you make me a co-host here?
For sure, let me just do that one quick second, Chris.
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple of questions coming out on the charts, and I'll address those. Yeah, there is an app that you guys can check out too if you want, called River App, which I've used in the past. And it's pretty good too. You can have favorite rivers and checkpoints and use that. I think it uses the same data, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. You're now the host, Chris.
Sorry?
You're now the host.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect. You can see that?
Yep. Great.
Not screen, that is. So we'll go right from the beginning here, I guess. So to get to the screen, just look up Water Office. You do that, you'll come to this. It's a government website. And there's a couple ways that you can view this. We're concerned about real-time hydrometric data. It's going to be where you live. And then in here, there's two things that you may want to play around with. One is station search, which is my go-to. There's also map search. So let's do map first. So it's pretty straightforward. Province and territory, obviously, we're doing with Ontario here. So that brings us to this. You can see there's more than a few rivers here, and those are certainly not all steelhead rivers. It's a great resource for bass rivers, trout rivers, whatever. Most rivers have at least one monitoring station on them. So if we start with something real local as an example, say the Credit. The Credit has a number of stations on it, probably up toward, maybe not quite 10 stations, but more than enough for us. There's one right at Streetsville Dam, so right at the heart of kind of steelhead country. Steelhead, of course, this time of year is open from 407 down to Britannia, and then again from 403 down to the lake. So this is kind of right in the heart of it. So you can click on that station and view report. When you do that, I'll get you a sign off in this disclaimer saying that if you drown because they told you the river was at a certain level, it's not their fault. But then you'll get to this, which is just a water level chart. And you'll see there's two lines here. And so I'm going to, yeah, sorry, cameras are just getting in right here. There's two sides to this chart. This side is water level in meters. And then this side is your discharge of water volume in cubic meters per second. Personally, I like to use the cubic meters side. I just find I can sort of relate to it better. I can visualize how much water this is. This is more of just sort of a random measurement depending on where the station is and how high water typically is. But it doesn't really matter because you'll see these lines correlate very, very closely. So you're basically getting the same info either way. Basically, you want to, ideally, in a perfect world, start keeping a bit of a log or have an idea of what level you fish a river at on a given day. And that way you'll start to sort of learn, okay, I know what 15 CMS looks like, 10 CMS, and you can sort of build a history off that and get to know what river you should hit on a given day. Now, if you're starting off, because I know we saw a couple of questions there about what level should I fish it at, it's all over the place depending on river, obviously. And it'll take some time before you are able to sort of build that log, even if it's just a mental log, to learn what you're looking for. So this is kind of a perfect example of what you want, actually. I'm not saying the credit's going to be awesome tomorrow, because that's still kind of high, actually. But this is generally a good trend. When you see water come up, you got to imagine rivers just spewing water out into a Great Lake. Fish sense that increase in water, and they can even smell their home river to a certain extent. And that's their cue to line up and file into the river. And obviously when things are mucky and fast and you can't see anywhere, fish might be firing up, but it's going to be hard to fish for them. So generally we're looking to fish on the drop. Usually we want to fish on a drop if we can manage it. Otherwise, I mean, we take what we can get. This is sort of your idea. And easy way to sort of figure out, suss out what might be a decent level if you don't know is if you scroll down here, you can see you can adjust the date range here. So this is, as you can see, only showing us the last week right now, which doesn't give us a huge amount of info. But if I want to see what this has been flowing at this season, let's start this at the start of September. Apply settings. Now we can sort of average things out. So you can see is, very steady, rise, fall, sort of similar pattern every time we get rain. And from this, you can sort of draw that the average flow is probably somewhere Now in around 10, between 5 to 10 is sort of average, and you get these exceptional rain events where it's just completely gone. Sometimes you see wacky things like this, which could easily just be an error on the chart. So take those with a grain of salt. But through this, we can see, okay, this last dumping of rain we got was pretty exceptional for this fall. I think we can all remember the last couple of days just how wet it's been around here. I think we're dealing with 40 plus millimeters of rain we've seen in the last couple of days. So it's expected this is about the biggest rain event we've seen this year. And so the spike here is bigger than these prior spikes. And you can see where we are right now, even though it's come down considerably, is actually at almost the peak of some of these others. So it still isn't that low. It's still got a little ways before it gets down to your average flows here. But just sort of roughly, very roughly, drawing an average flow line in your mind and then relating the water to that can be a handy tool there. And then there's other things to consider which we might get into, such as if you fished the river before, you might have some idea of its substrate. Is it a silty river? Is it a rocky river? Rocky rivers tend to not get dirty as quickly. Silty rivers, they get mucked up quickly. So sometimes you can draw inferences from that. But this is a really easy way to start building that that knowledge for you. And then, you can jump around to all different stations. I do this constantly. You could ask me where I'm going to fish when we're off this Monday. I've got no clue, because on Sunday night, I'm going to look at this chart. I'm going to reference a few different rivers and see what's looking good the next day. Show you the other way you can use this once you get a little more familiar with the site. We've got the same page, but instead of going to map search, we can use station search. I find this just a little quicker and easier to use. You don't need to know the station name. You can just type in credit. And then it's going to give you the different monitoring stations. So you can see you've got some trout country stations up here as well. If you're going to do some trout fishing in the spring, for resident trout, that is, you can always reference those higher up ones. The one that we were just on, again, was Streetsville, and it'll give me the same info, same chart, just another way to access the same thing there. And these are usually town names, so if you aren't sure where they are, obviously the map helps, or you can just Google where the town is more or less, and just try and find the station closest to where you're fishing. Now, let's not say you should ignore other charts. What I'll do here, well, different chart actually. Sure. So this is that one.
Chris, before you go on, there was a question about turbidity, water clarity, and how you can possibly predict how clear things are.
Yeah, so I've heard a theory on this, and I kind of like it, but I've got to be honest, I don't know how true it is. So there are some stations out there with actual turbidity meters. There is actually one for the credit. As an example, there are very few of these in Ontario as far as I'm aware, but the easiest way would be this. Take the credit as an example. This is cvc.ca. So this is Credit Valley Conservation. I always forget where their stations are. It's under here, Watershed Science, I believe.
I think the water quality table, you were just there.
Oh, let me see. Oh yeah.
Might be there.
I'm not sure it's water quality. It might be. Yeah, no, that would make sense, I suppose.
Yep, turbidity. Just scroll up.
Pretty low down, I know, towards the mouth. Or Old Dairy would work too.
You scroll up, Chris, just slightly. On the right-hand side.
Ready, yeah.
There we go.
The specific station that works. Maybe we'll just jump back. I'm not sure this one actually has turbidity. It's just a numbering again, unless you know what that looks like. It's not very handy without a reference chart. It's not showing anything, so that might not have that specific feature. Well, it doesn't really matter which one we choose. There is one. Oh, that's this one right there. See if that works. The Golf and Country Club should say we're not recommending anybody fish down here, but this is pretty close to the lake. And again, near, say, Arendelle Park, popular steelheading area. So you can see other features, dissolved oxygen, temperature. Temperature can be great. Fish obviously use that as a cue, and their activity is largely based on temperature, but there is turbidity here. So this, very understandable. You see it ramp up with the rain and again fall down. So if you, same thing, took the time to learn these charts, again, you could just use the number, say it's at 10.7, 885, whatever, and have a rough idea of what that looks like, or you can just follow the trends. And so by this, I would guess the credit probably looks okay right now. So that's one feature. I believe only credit conservation has that. I don't think the Grand does. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else. The other theory that I've heard, again, I've not had the time to properly put this to the test and see how well it works, but it's using these two lines. So again, reviewing what they are, the green line here relates to the left side of this chart. It's water level. So it's the physical height of the water wherever the station is. And the orange line relates to the right here. It's your cubic meters per second, your discharge, your volume of water, how much water is actually pushing through. If you imagine, you could have a river that's quite swollen and high, but that isn't moving very quickly. And then you could have something like a flash flood where you have a huge amount of volume that hasn't really been reflected in the water level. Generally, these lines will meet up more or less at some points because it's going to even out. But there comes a point around here where they diverge generally. So where the water level might still be up, but there's less volume moving through in that same water. And so the theory goes that if there's less push, less water moving through, that even though it's still maybe a little high, this parting could signal an improvement in clarity. It makes sense to me, but again, I don't know how perfectly it's correlated to visibility. I've never really put that to the test. So generally, I just go by general levels. Even then, you'll see these roughly correlate to each other. They're pretty close. So I go by levels more than anything else. If somebody knows a better system, I'm all ears. That's all I really got there.
Yeah, so I have seen that there is that trend. It does stay true where those lines do diverge. The Maitland, for example, is a great example. And you watch the lines, they do diverge and the water is getting clearer and clearer. So it goes from pretty deep mud into some pretty clear water, and it does follow a trend in that sense. So if you're looking at those charts and you see those lines diverge, it's getting clearer. Might be high, but getting clearer anyways.
There's another interesting thing I feel is necessary to mention is that water levels are very different fall, winter, and spring. So just because you fish something at one level at one point doesn't actually mean, strange as it may sound, that the river will look anything alike season to season at the same levels. And the reason for that is this. In the summer, things are really low generally. And so there's not a lot of push. And when there's not a lot of push in the water, sediment settles. And so you get a lot of silt and particulate matter and leaves and things falling in, decaying, that settle on the bottom of the river, and there's nothing to clean it out. And so I find personally in the fall, when you get those first few big bumps of water, that's enough to really purge the system of all that stuff. Some rivers with weeds too, like the Grand River, is very well known for being quite weedy early season, or sort of mid-season as those weeds die off and detach. But then, say in the winter, you can have a very high and clear river because all that stuff has been purged out throughout the fall. And the other thing in the winter is, of course, that the banks freeze, and so you get less mud running into the rivers too. And in the spring, early spring, it follows the same kind of line, where if you imagine all that soft mud and stuff along the banks, it's been frozen all winter, and then you get, the defrosting of the ground, which then loosens all that. And so generally in March, April, you'll get pretty quick muddying of rivers. But then come, later April around opener, or even into May, you can have, again, pretty high swollen rivers and pretty decent clarity. So as an example with the credit, and again, I'm not advising that any of these levels are necessarily safe to fish. There's no such thing as a safe river, as there was inherent risk. And I'm not saying these are even going to be perfect fishing levels, but through the fall, anywhere from 5 to 10, I find pretty manageable. There's a little freebie for you. Beyond that, maybe if you're comfortable fishing high water, I know some guys who like it right up toward 20, but they like fishing huge flies and really heavy tips and are confident waders. I've seen the credit as high as 25 in the spring and had a solid 3 to 4 feet of visibility. You would never have that this time of year. It would be absolute mud. So yeah, it's weird, but depending on the season, you might find it looks very different depending on the levels that you have there.
Yeah, so that's a lot of information to take in terms of water flows and charts and clarity and turbidity, but it really directly correlates to success on the river steelheading. If you go out there blindly, show up at the Saugeen, the Maitland, the Big Head, the mouth of the Beaver, or the Credit, anywhere without having this great information and doing your homework and research, it really could handicap you for the day of fishing because you were arriving to maybe not great conditions. So in terms of this info, there's a ton there. It's a lot to learn, but really you can summarize it in terms of if the water is rising, if it's peaked and it's just at its peak, it's probably not the best time to get out. As the water does drop, as the river does come down and bows down, that line does decrease. That's a better time to hit the water. Some rivers really do well right at the drop, like the Big Head, for example, as the water is just dropping. It can be fantastic. Other rivers need a few days to settle down. The Grand, for example, if you get lots of rain throughout the Grand River watershed, which is huge. It involves the Myth, the Conestoga, above Bellwood Lake as well. If that receives a ton of rain, it may take a couple of weeks for it to settle down and really clear up as well. So a ton of info, and we're hitting this pretty hard in terms of information for the water flows. But this is an essentially it's a critical part of steelheading is knowing what water to fish and when, and being able to choose the river well and hit those conditions to really maximize your success.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a thing that's so unique about any migratory species, but obviously steelhead in this case is that the fishing can be so ephemeral and it's so timing based that knowing how to fish is one thing, but these fish don't live in one place. They're just passing through, and you have to intercept them. And so timing really is the make or break. If anyone here has ever say had a day with a guide going out for steelhead, chances are they didn't tell you where you were fishing until maybe a week out. And there is a reason for that, is that as good as the guides are and as well as they can fish, they need the fish to be there. And so they reference this info as much as anyone. You can't force it to happen. If the fish aren't there or the river's not in shape to fish it, it's not going to go well. You can maybe grind it out and really push for something to happen, but it's not going to be consistent for you. So yeah, this really is at the core of everything here.
Yep, absolutely. And, driving 2.5 hours to hit a river that's muddy, I'm going to turn around and go home, and that's a lot of gas, a lot of time. It really is, great to know. And this resource is. Oh yeah, I've done that. I've got up there. I didn't look at the charts. yeah, absolutely. So great piece of information here, and a ton of information. I can rewatch this again, but look at these charts. And what you can do. One last tip before you get to move on to the next topic here is that if you really want to watch a trend of a river, and there's multiple stations, look at those stations going from top to bottom and see what that river is doing, so you can time it. Maybe 2 days from now it'll come into fishable conditions, but just hit those and you can see what the trend is upriver to downriver, not just one station as well. Look at the tributaries too. For example, on the Grand, look at the Nith, what the Nith is doing. That river. Here we go.
Come on, show me the Nith.
You have to actually go to the Nith, Chris. On the left-hand side, you'll see that just exactly the Nith. Far left.
Sorry. Yeah, that's right. There is a separate chart for it.
Yeah, so the Nith is nefarious for pumping mud into the Grand, and you could have a pretty good water above the Nith, and all of a sudden this mud flow comes in and actually washes it out in terms of just mud. So don't just look at the place you want to fish, because it may have rained way more upstream. So you want to hit those charts exactly following trends of water flow. So look at the Nith, look at the Conestoga, look at the upper, maybe even the Shan Dam discharge as well, which if they do open it up to make room for more incoming rain, it could wash out the entire river from top to bottom as well.
I just thought of a good example. I don't know if there's a chart for this specific one, but just to show people the kind of effect a single tributary can have on a river, I think this is a really clear one on the map, at least. So this is the Saugeen up around Paisley. This is the North Saugeen flowing in. You see the color change? So you can imagine if that river goes up, what it's going to do to everything below it.
Yeah, if you have pockets of rain that could dump tons of rain just on the North Saugeen, you could wash out the lower river, but it could be pretty low conditions, period, and the water level could be quite approachable. So really look at those monitors, really get out there and sort of build those trends for yourself. So we're going to move on to the next topic because we can talk about more about this for a while, but really look at those charts, build those trends, and keep a log for yourself. So when you do get out there, have a little book at home. Write down, hey, the flow of this river at this date was this, conditions were this clarity. Looking at the charts, those lines were diverging. Just build a trend for yourself. So when you do get out there, you want to fish any of those rivers, you have some information to go on. Huge. All right, so we'll move on because we can definitely, we're not bore anyone tonight, even though it's all great information. So in terms of what's next, Chris?
Did you have any other slides there or no?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, lots more slides to go in terms of presentation. So I'm going to throw the hosting back over to you. You can screen share.
Yep. Where is that? Cool. Should have it now. Cool,
right on, awesome. So we'll get back to sharing a screen here. Actually, a few questions did come in. Are there any good color-coded watershed maps? Not that I know of, unfortunately. Yeah. I couldn't tell you on that one.
But there are some weird resources out there, like certain conservation authorities and groups sort of involved with rivers sometimes put things together, and sometimes they're like weird PDFs you find online. But no, generally there's not a ton, unfortunately, on Ontario rivers. I saw the other mention about Ohio and Michigan rivers having more turbidity readers. Yeah, US has a lot of that. We just don't, unfortunately. I guess somebody mentioned the Grand has some. I've got to find those then, but yeah. A rising and falling levels good. Saw that one just now.
Yeah, and also touch on Bruce's question there. It's about to go back to successful spawning of fish species. There's a ton of successful spawning of Great Lakes salmon, not just steelhead as well. So once again, the argument that these fish are stocked, people harvest them for their eggs and for bait and all those things. Those fish really do need to spawn to improve the robustness of the health of our runs. So a lot of folks, if you ever hear someone say these fish are just stock fish, well, there's a ton of natural reproduction, and those fish really need to spawn. So yeah, great question, and we'll sort of just boogie on from there.
The rising and falling levels one, I would say fall is better than rise generally, but both can be good. I was out the other day fishing a rise, and it was good. A lot of the time, you'll have a point at which sort of a tipping point where things do start changing clarity-wise, and sometimes I think that throws the fish for a bit of a loop. So even what could be a good clarity on the drop, it just kind of shocks the fish, I think. So I would say drop is better, but early on the rise can be good.
Cool. Right on. Excellent. Jump back to the screen. Do a screen share here for the rest of the, more of the presentation anyways. Let me just get this up here and do a full screen view. All right, so in terms of fish, as we mentioned, these Great Lakes steelhead are rainbow trout. They need the same thing as any other resident trout does. So oxygen, cover, shelter, and current breaks, things to rest, and food as well. So if you're looking at all these factors, these are resident, they're like resident trout in terms of their needs when they hit the river. So look for those things. Look for riffles, look for oxygen. Look for current breaks, look for structure, boulders, look for log jams, all those things as well, and a food source as well too. You have bait fish in rivers, you have crayfish, which steelhead do eat crayfish. They're in the system, so they have all that food at their disposal. We're going to look at hitting and fishing runs either on a swing or nymphing or centerpin or other gears throughout the seasons too. It's a big part of approaching steelhead is knowing where to fish in those spots. You have a huge run with mixed conditions in terms of fast water, slow water, but where do you actually find fish throughout times of year? So in terms of early season, I'm looking at the very top of riffles and runs, like the heads of pools, water's coming in, it's very oxygenated. those fish in warmer water temperatures need more oxygen, and they will find that right at the heads of those pools, water's a bit faster, but they have some metabolism to support faster water and more movement. So you'll find them just up there as well. So early season, if I'm going to maybe hit the Grand for maybe an early run of steelhead, the water temperatures are really low. I'll be looking at those riffles and runs myself. When you get into the mid-season, the water temperatures are quite approachable. You have lots of oxygen in the river. Those fish could be anywhere, and that's a bit of a challenge. They could be in the heads of pools, they could be in the riffles, runs, they could be the body of the pool, really tanky stuff, or the tailouts as well. So you have a ton of options of where to find those fish.
Just thinking, Rob, it might be good to equate this to like a water temperature too. Like we've beat people over the head so much about water temperature and trout. This is really the same thing.
Yeah,
I would say you're talking like mid-season would be for me like high 40s to mid to maybe high 50s. Would you say?
Yep.
And then our late season, early season is just bookending that. If you want to relate that to something.
Yeah, because you can catch fish in water temperatures that are just above freezing. Those fish are pretty lethargic, but they're there, but they're not going to move very far. So you're going to find areas where they're going to be more inclined to stay and expend less energy to meet their metabolic states. So huge is there is fish for the fish where the fish are, and it's where they have to be, not where they maybe want to be. And maybe it is where they want to be as well. So through the mid-season, you're looking at the riffles, runs, the bodies of pools and tailouts. I've had an amazing experience a few years ago on the Maitland where I was swimming through the top of a run in the riffle of water and had a fish just smoke my fly. It went berserk. The water was in a mid-season temperature and absolutely just schooled me. It was fantastic. And it was right where I would have usually walked right past because of just the speed of the water. But I took a flyer out there right in the head of it. Absolutely smoked me as well. I've caught fish in those big, slow, long, tanky pools as well, and in tailouts throughout the mid-season. Now, in terms of the late season, looking at water flows, which are way, way slower, the heavy stuff on the fast heads of the runs and heads of the pools. Looking at what you would want to call a slow walking pace, like take a very easy stroll down the river, and that slow walking pace is what those fish might be orienting towards. It's not the fast stuff, not the ultra frog water, which is barely moving, but a nice walking pace. So look for that. That's a big cue for me. If I see that nice walking pace water, I tend to fish that. If there's holding structure down there too, if I see boulders, a bit of surface disturbance in the water, so it has some depth to it, that's a great spot to fish, but that slower walking pace is great. Yep. Cool. We are dealing with a ton of different conditions this season. Early season, we had low water, it hit with high water, and it's been high water for a while. And then finding fish in high water can be a challenge because we tend to think that fish are not where they are. And we hear tons of stories of this where people on the west coast of Canada fishing for steelhead on big rivers, the water is absolutely way high and they're bombing casts out to the middle of the river, but the fish aren't there. The fish are really within maybe 30 feet of the bank or less because they're finding current breaks. You're not bombing things out there, you're not hitting these crazy standing waves. The fish aren't going to be there. I learned this lesson on the Niagara myself, where I was on the banks of the river bombing casts out to the middle of the current where it was absolutely raging a torrent. And I never caught a fish there. All the fish I caught were on the dangle by the bank because there were current breaks and it was easier for the fish to survive and stay. So in terms of where you are fishing during high water, really think about fish being efficient. It sounds kind of funny having fish and efficient. It's a great little pun there, but they really are. So look for that softer water, look for those easy escapes. Expending less energy is a huge part of that. This is a section of river on the Credit River. Looking at where, say, a bend comes down, the river flow is going from left to right. Those red arrows are a heavy, heavy current. Fish generally won't be there unless they're buried deep behind a rock or a boulder or a log. They're finding the easier route upriver or that softer water to hold on the banks in those insides of those turns, and where that softer water is, that slower water. So if you're going to fish high water, don't bomb casts out. You're probably not going to find fish there. It's really that softer stuff towards the edge you're going to find those fish. Low water conditions, okay, those fish have now moved off of those areas because the water comes down. That water is way more exposed in terms of threats to them, whether it's overhead threats of birds, things like that, things off the bank, and they're going to want to recede back into those more safe areas. So deeper slots, troughs and rivers, big deep pools behind structure, under logs, things like that as well. So really take the time and fish those areas in lower water conditions. If you look at Google Maps, and we'll get to there as well, and how to read a river using satellite imagery, is during the low water periods, those really dark slots in the river where those deeper pools are, that's where the fish are going to be, not in the shallows, not in those exposed areas, in those deeper spots. So in low water, that same section of river, those fish are no longer along the bank. They're in those deeper areas. You can see they're highlighted there, like that darker waters. That's where you want to be spending your time fishing, and not those really shallow sides where the fish were during the high water conditions. During mid water conditions, you have to read the river, find out where those fish are. But usually, for me, I find the river is either high or it's low. That's kind of how it rolls these days in Southern Ontario.
And just, sort of go back, like when in doubt, to the water temperature thing, right?
Yes, exactly. Reference that again and fish those areas.
Yeah, it's mid-water. It's still gonna be deeper stuff if it's cold out, and it's gonna be the faster stuff if it's warm potentially. So.
Yep. So we'll look at what we call A and B water now. It's when you get to a river and you find a ton of folks on the water. It's great to be able to fish those ideal pools, those textbook pools. You're looking at that exact water choice, like, hey, my preference, I can get down here. Every pool is mine. Every run is mine. But living in Southern Ontario, it gets really busy. And a lot of times those spots are taken up and they get kind of hogged once in a while by all types of anglers. So what we want to do is find other types of water that could hold fish. And a great thing to remember is that fish that are stressed, they'll want to stay in environments that they're stressed. They will move out of those areas. They might find out secondary holding places, those smaller slots behind the boulders and pocket water. So when you are looking at that textbook stuff we've talked about, we can always move on from there and find fish in less than obvious areas sometimes. A great example is the Big Head. That's a fantastic example, is that if you get out there and you see these pools in the Big Head, fantastic, a classic pool. You have the riffle, the head of the pool, the body, and the tail out. But sometimes those fish, they leave there and actually end up sitting in the small pockets behind boulders and in those hydroplanes or in those hydro pockets too in front of boulders that most folks will just walk past thinking a steelhead wouldn't hit there and sit there. But that river is great because you can leave those areas which are heavily inundated with pressure and all types of anglers and hit those small little pockets and find a ton of success in those. And that you can replicate that on the Big Head, any river, on the Credit, any river that you can go to, you can find success just like that as well. So there's your classic water. Sure, it's busy, lots of folks are around, those fish are stressed, then move on to that B water that's way less prime in a sense, doesn't look as classic. And you may overlook it on a regular day, but you can definitely find those spots. And a great way to find those spots is use Google Earth or Apple Maps and find those small, tiny little slots that are a little darker through a run. If you find an odd boulder somewhere, that could be that B water as well. So really use all the resources in terms of satellite imagery, reading water, those little pockets, and really get to love the B water, because there's many times that B water can be your success for the day. Chris, any notes on that?
No, that's good.
Cool, right on. Now, in terms of like all fishing itself, not just steelheading, you want to fish thoroughly. I see a big issue in terms of angling is that a lot of folks hit to the river, they get there, they have a very static setup for a very dynamic river. They get there and they have a single sink tip on, where there's a fast sink tip or intermediate sink tip for if they're swinging a fly. It might be the same shotting pattern on a center pin or a fly rod, and the same depth, and they hit every pool, every run, and everything using the exact same setup, not changing depth. And that can really hamper your day because you're not evolving to the changing conditions. So be dynamic with the river and change with it. And I'm talking about step to step sometimes. If you walk up a river and you change where you're standing by a couple of yards or feet, or you cast a little further out to hit the next seam or line, that could be entirely different than what you were just fishing. So with all fishing, stay dynamic and get out there and put your presentation where it needs to be for those fish. Trying to tell a fish to come up 8 feet for a fly sometime is not going to happen. You have to make sure that that fly is in their zone. Putting it in their zone is going to make success happen way easier for you out there. So get your fly down to where it needs to be. Change your depth of presentation, going deeper, shallower, adding more weight or taking some weight off, whether it be a sink tip or split shot, and then get to those fish. So fish well, fish thoroughly. adapt to different flows and how you present as well. Try the variety of flies, but don't change flies too often. That's something we see a lot too, is folks don't have confidence in the fly that they have on. They flip a fly up, put a new one on. You spend more time changing flies than they do actually fish. And that's a problem. You want to have a chance to fish those flies thoroughly and really get that fly fished well with confidence, and then determine like, yeah, you know what, this has been through fish. Fish have seen it. They've just said, absolutely no, I don't want to, they don't want that flies to change flies at that point. And then, fish it well, fish all the water you can. Just don't, make a couple of weird casts blindly. Just get out there and, fish it well. One big thing too is fish with confidence. If you're out there second guessing yourself, you're not going to fish very well. That's all species, including steelhead. So when you're out there, have confidence. Pick the fly that you like, fish it well. Just be confident. It makes a huge difference. It's absolutely amazing what it actually can do. The confidence on the river itself. Once again, I can't repeat it more, but rivers are dynamic. We have to be dynamic with them. So don't be static. Change things up. Change your sink tip. If you're going through a run and you're swinging a fly with a single hand or spay rod, change at your sink tip. So it's not just a fast sink all the way through. I'm fishing, the tail out. Let's go for an intermediate tip and an unweighted fly, or change things up to really fish those conditions very well. Don't be stuck. And it's tough if you're fishing in, 4-degree temperatures, it's raining sideways, the wind's out there, your hands are cold. You really want to go into your pocket and pull out your sink tip wallet, take off your poly leader or your Mo tip, and then fire a new one back on. No way. You want to sit there with your hands in your pocket and stay warm, make tight little casts. But if you're going to fish well and make your success happen, you have to go through those things and change it, whether it's a nice day or bad day in the water in terms of weather. So just really, really be dynamic. I can't stress that enough. So in terms of on the fly, so if you are new to fly fishing or any sort of other type of tackle, nymphing, which is dead drifting a fly either under an indicator or on a tight line, lots of ways to nymph, and that you're putting either egg patterns or nymphs or worm patterns as well. Worm patterns are fantastic. If you're right beside me as well, no one's here is afraid, the shop's afraid to fish a pink worm. You can use all sorts of things under an indicator or nymph them. You can swing flies with a single hand rod, or you can fish them with a spay rod or switch rod too. You can even use your center pin and swing your presentation out towards the end of your drift as well. So you can get that swinging action as well. So you're able to really utilize everything. Stripping streamers is something that really is not done too commonly in Ontario for some reason. It is really water temperature based. I think we have to talk about too is that, an aggressive form of presentation, stripping a fly fast. Fish has to be in a metabolic state to chase that fly. So in the spring, it's a great way to do it. You can have some really cool strikes and really fun activity on the water. Early season with steelhead, absolutely, you can do that too. Like all your big trout flies, all your articulated stuff, you can bring those things out, have a lot of fun with it. I'll look back on an amazing experience with Ian Troop floating down the Maitland River. There was this really neat rock formation, this seam. We're drifting down, and Ian just said, flick out a fly over the seam, kind of twitch it back and see what happens. So I did. I had my short spay rod with me, had my little 2-fly on there, and twitched it over top of this rock ledge, and this about maybe 6 or 7 pound rainbow, like the Great Lakes steelhead, migratory fish, comes up, opens its mouth like a Montana trout eat on a river, and I saw this thing happen in full sight, and I froze. I'm like, oh my god, what did I do? It was the most exciting thing I had in terms of takes of steelhead. It was so visual, but it was chasing a streamer being twitched along a seam or a rock cut. So don't think that you can't strip flies for steelhead or Great Lakes steelhead. It's very, very possible to do. If you are into other forms of angling, which is fantastic, if you're out there casting spoons, that works very well too. You can use lures or paddles, all sorts of stuff like that. Inline spinners are great too. You can float fish using indicators or floats. Fly anglers use indicators, float guys use floats. So we can definitely sort of learn from ourselves in that sort of sharing of technique. We all do it. I can bottom bounce too. It's not really done as often down this way. Lots of guys on the North Shore did it a long time ago. Really, really effective as well. I'm not an expert on it, so I'll leave that to somebody else to talk about, but it's quite good. There's a note about, I saw one pop up about dry flies for steelhead. If you like catching fish or like catching steelhead in Ontario, you might not want to fish a dry fly. The fish around here aren't super inclined to take a dry fly. You can't skate fly. It's very particular in the time of year you can do it. The water temperature has to be a little warmer. It can't be like 4 degrees. It really has to be a really particular set of circumstances and conditions to catch fish on a dry fly or skated fly in Ontario, or anywhere for that matter. Cool. That's about the end of that slideshow. We have lots to talk about in terms of fly selection. We have flies in front of us too, so we can talk lots about that. I think lots of questions came in, Chris.
I've got a small novel going, yes.
All right, right on. Perfect. Cool. Let's hit the questions.
Sorry?
Let's hit those questions and we'll get back. There's actually a few more slides there. Yeah.
Are there? Okay. I've got these sort of in no particular order, but I guess I'll try and relate it to stuff we've already talked about. So for Malcolm, what temperature and flow do you look for? I guess we kind of already covered that. I'd say ideally, that water, 45 maybe to 60, anywhere in there, fish are going to be at the most active, I would say. But there have been times when I know the credit, as an example, has been best week of the year has been mid-February. So I think it's sort of relative to what the fish are used to as well, right? If fish have been sitting in ice cold water for a month and suddenly you get a couple warm days, that can, I think, really turn them on. So I don't know if there's a real rule for that. Obviously, the level thing is very variable. I don't know if you have anything to add on that. I feel like we covered that pretty well.
Yeah, pretty well on that one. There was tactics for high water. So I would say fish that will the inside seams and slots. If it is dirty, use a bigger fly as well. Fishing very deep water, bigger flies for that too. So we can, that's a couple little tips.
I'd say, there's probably, a few things we could expand on there. So in terms of the location of fish, I think you got it. But there's some other things too. So yes, soft water is good. Sometimes really slack water, like inside turns and undercuts and things like that, just like you say, and fishing at your feet. There have been times when I've gotten to a river and I've driven a ways and it's been really high and muddy, and confidence is just down the drain. And best way to do it is honestly just to pick a small part of the water, I think, you think is high percentage, and work it to death. And I've caught fish like that, and felt like a Hail Mary literally under my feet. So that's about it. But I would say another prime spot you can target, and there are a few places like this I can think of, probably one or two on almost any river, is if you have another tributary flowing into that river that offers some clear water, that can be a great spot to hit. The water level may not be ideal still, it might be quite high, but the clarity is something that fish will appreciate. Fish don't exactly like trying to breathe in muddy water and sucking in all that mud, so they'll search out clean water if they can. So that can be a good little tip, I would say. And another one, more of sort of a meta game, would be when you're thinking of where to go on a given day. If say, yesterday was a really good example, where just pretty well every river I could think of would have been blowing yesterday with all that water, is maybe think, okay, I can check out a bigger river, but there's a good chance it's going to be high. What other options do I have nearby? So an example of that would be, when it's in season, obviously there's not much water to fish on the Ganaraska right now, but if the Ganaraska is high, you've got several small rivers nearby. Or if you go to the Nottawasaga, the Beaver is just up the road. Or if you go to the Maitland, the Bayfield's just down the road. So, it's nice to think about it that way and give yourself options, I think. High water, what else? Bigger flies, brighter stuff, but don't underestimate the vision of steelhead. It can track relatively small stuff. But really just, find a piece of water and just work it to death and break down that water into smaller pieces. Like, people get intimidated by big rivers. We talk about that a lot when we're talking about, how do I break down a big river? But a small river can become big very quickly. And if you can just cut it down into a small piece, that can, I think, make it easier. Yeah,
in terms of steelhead's vision as well, or a fish's vision, we look into a river and it's not backlit, it's this dark lit. I'm not sure what you can, if it's a term for that, but if you're on the bottom of a river and you put yourself at the very bottom of it, you turn upwards, it's backlit, and they can see way more than we can in terms of reference points. So don't think that they can't see your fly. It's worthwhile going for a swing. If it's complete mud, you have inches of visibility, maybe that's not great. Maybe you could still catch a fish or two, but it's going to be a really tough go. But really don't underestimate what a fish can see. So really, it's if you have 2 or 3 feet of visibility, for us, that's many more feet for the fish that are down there, if not meters. So let's keep that in mind as well.
You can 2 to 3 feet. I mean, if you were to pick a perfect visibility level, for me, that's it.
Yep. Yeah, the fish are actually comfortable in that. They don't feel vulnerable. They don't have this, super clear aquarium to swimming in anymore. So it's actually quite good.
Yeah, they're comfortable. Cool. Just running down the list here. Could you discuss fly selection in relation to type of water, time of year? That's got to be broken into multiple categories, obviously. Swung flies, nymph flies, whatever.
Yep.
Maybe you want to touch on nymphs quickly, if somebody's nymphing.
Yep, absolutely. So early season, I really put a lot of attention on egg patterns. If when salmon are in the streams and in the rivers, they're depositing eggs. So why wouldn't you feed the steelhead what they're feeding on naturally? They're eating those eggs. So lots of patterns that do work. You can even use mop flies. It doesn't even look like an egg, but it could be an egg to a fish. An egg cluster. You have some really fun eggs at the shop called like the bacon and eggs. It's actually a worm and egg pattern combined. Really cool there. But egg patterns in general work very well. Even if you have like a pheasant tail with a hot orange bead, that's an egg pattern to a fish. So don't think about particularly matching the exact color and shape and size of an egg. Just get an egg something in the water itself, and it usually does pretty well. And you can get really great egg patterns, great imitations, carry them at the shop. You can tie your own, but those also do work well too. I like putting a bit of weight on my eggs, a small bead or a tungsten bead to help them get down a little bit more. That's a great tip for me anyways. I like that little bit of extra help for them. In terms of getting a bit later into the season, eggs still work down the road too, but over the winter, steelhead tend to get more trouty and focus on bugs called the bug bite. Looking at stoneflies, looking at all sorts of nymphs that do work very well. Egg patterns still will work, but I find that that nymphs do better throughout the winter into the spring. They're fantastic too. Something that a lot of folks don't do is go really small for nymphs in the spring. And I've had some amazing days in the water fishing very small nymphs. There was a day on the Ganaraska with the Buddy Chauncey some years ago, and we hit what would have been a fantastic day. We couldn't believe that fish weren't taking flies. Thought about it, stepped back. The water, the sun did come out, it was quite high. There's a lot of pressure on the water, and we actually started using flies in the size 16 range of pheasant tails and hare's ears, and started nailing fish pretty consistently. So don't be afraid to go small with your flies and nymphs too, especially in the spring as well. Worm patterns work fantastic. Pink worms and steelhead, that's kind of synonymous. So if you have squirmy worms, if you have pink sandalwood type worms, things like that, dynamite. After you have a bit of a rainstorm, these things do get washed in, and fish will absolutely clobber these things. So nymphs, absolutely, they're great. In terms of colors, light pinks for worms. You can do hot reds, browns even. They work at times of year. In terms of egg patterns, when you look at a steelhead or salmon, when it deposits an egg or like lays an egg, what happens is that color of egg really dissipates very quickly. Within minutes, it's changing color from this really hot orange, and it's going into really much duller tones. So having a variety of egg colors really does help to sort of match the hatch in a sense, or you're hitting what those fish are feeding on and those colors. Now, in terms of sizes too, I find that when the water clarity is quite dark anyways, it's a bit muddy, that bigger flies do work and poppier colors do quite well. When the water does come down and the clarity is, it's much clearer, especially into the spring, those really light colors do quite well. Looking at like creams, like light chartreuses, things like that. So a variety of eggs, different sizes and colors, of a bit of weight to some of them too, really does quite well.
I definitely agree. Generally, good rule of thumb for me is start out season with like brighter oranges and stuff, and then fade out pretty quickly. Another thing to think of is so we think of salmon season sort of winding down this time of year, but there will always be some fish into November easily, and so there's still eggs around, and they're also very early spawning steelhead even in February. So there are generally eggs around. And in those high water periods, just like Rob said, worms get washed in the river. The other thing that happens in high water is that the gravel that salmon have laid their eggs in does get disturbed sometimes, and will actually release almost a second batch of eggs. Those things are usually brown or white, at least. They're definitely not big juicy things, but sometimes that could be worth a shot too. He said a small nymph thing. That's not just a spring thing. I was out the other day and did very well on a size 16 hare's ear. Tiny little thing. I was fishing that and an egg pattern, and doing better on the nymph. and the fish were hitting it hard. They were coming from a ways away and hitting it. But small eggs can be a really, really worthwhile thing too. I'm not sure. Yeah, I've got one here. This is actually a Paul Castellano thing, if I can drop his name. But I don't know if you can see that. That's tiny, tiny little tuft of egg yarn on a hook, size 16 there. That's like your single egg kind of thing. Clear water, don't be afraid to bust out some really small stuff for pressured water. I know we had one question about fish in pressured water. I think if I remember, it was more related to the swing, but yeah, small stuff can work great. Alternatively, giant stuff can work great too, like just mixing it up, getting different stuff in front of fish can pay off for sure.
Yeah, perspective I like to think sometimes is when a fish was, I guess, smolt in the river, it's, it was yay big, and comparison of size, the stoneflies and nymphs they're eating were quite large. Sometimes, in terms of comparison and proportion of size of fish, absolutely, those big things can work because they were at one point eating things that were way in perspective bigger for them. So don't worry about fishing some bigger stuff too. The Hail Marys, I love the Hail Marys. You get out there and it's a slow day and you're like, oh, nothing's working. And you throw on the biggest, gnarliest, nastiest bug you have in your box and all of a sudden it produces for you. So don't be afraid of putting those really big, nasty flies on. And it could be the ticket that saves the day. That's a strategy within trout season for resident trout too, but sometimes throw an ungodly big fly in something and somewhere and get a fish to aggressively strike at it. So don't be afraid to just fish anything kind of thing. I would say there's always rules and general things you can do to really improve your success and have consistent success, and then also break all the rules too, because there's some days where the rules don't apply anymore. So it's have fun and throw whatever's in your box.
Yeah. That said, you probably want to start with kind of the staple stuff.
Yes.
Because more days than not, it probably still, like the boring stuff, your pheasant tails, your egg patterns, and your medium-sized stoneflies and worms are still probably going to day in, day out be the pattern. But yeah, absolutely have some ridiculous stuff on the sides for sure.
Yeah, there was one of my guides on the Yakima River back in a few years ago in the Sage X was released, went down for the launch of the rod and it was floating down the river with this pretty good guide. And in his truck, there was a fly on the roof, which was absolutely ridiculous. It was tied as a joke, but it was a gigantic woolly bugger with a pink tail, I think a chartreuse body, and had San Juan worms like tied all the way through it. So it was absolutely ridiculous. But I looked at it, I'm thinking like, that could work. That could absolutely get a fish interested enough, just want to smack at something, and that's it. So don't be afraid to throw some of the ridiculous fun stuff out there as well. But I would start, as Chris says, go with your standards and move on from there as well.
Yeah. That was sort of a two-part question, I guess, as we did talk about nymphs, but we have not talked about swung flies. I don't know if you want to come back to this or just talk quickly about swung flies.
Cool. Swung flies. Geez, where do you start? It's a big topic. We can really cut down quickly on this one.
I mean, you're still just relating it back to your regular food items, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Early season, I think one thing that I think a lot of spay guys or just swinging flies, don't have to spay fish, obviously, to swing a fly, miss is the bait fish. The fact that these fish are fresh out of the lake and for the last number of years have been eating bait fish, those smelts, shiners, alewife. And so literal bait fish patterns, white with olive over the top, whatever it may be. You're pulling something out there, it looks like.
There you go, like a great little bait fish color,
exactly.
Colored fly right there. Fantastic. Really natural.
That could easily be a crayfish or a sculpin too.
Yep.
But yeah, your real bait fish are a great one early season. And there are those, sometimes you get a good number of shiners in a river, say, and so that may continue, but that tends to be a really good early season one. And then, there are crayfish in the rivers. Crayfish activity generally tapers down as it gets cold. Crayfish, they molt shells and they kind of hide under rocks and they just aren't as around. But there are sculpins around still. They'll still be available food sources for fish. And so that's where your olives and browns and stuff kind of come in there, and you can fish those pretty well anytime. And then, you've got your, what a lot of people think of when they think of steelhead flies, your ridiculous West Coast style stuff, your pinks, your purples, your blacks, blues, whatever, which could work anytime. The more attractory kind of things. And, I'd say when the water's clear, you're probably better fishing more natural stuff, but they certainly work. I really like to get into those brighter colors and real dark profile flies through the winter months. And then again, it's sort of opposite effect in spring. You're fishing a lot more natural colors and stuff as the water clears, and you get, things like those crayfish more active. And then those bait fish flies start working really well in the spring too, again, because you have the juvenile salmon in the rivers, your alvins, and other young of the year bait fish too. But salmon eggs, they'll hatch into alvins, immature salmon in the spring and around, steelhead opener kind of time. And so smaller white patterns can work really well then too. So that's, I don't know, kind of how I think of it. I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about, size of fly, weight of fly, all that.
Yeah. I would say one thing important to talk about is that your fly is very much secondary to the placement of your fly and what the fly is doing. If you could have the most productive fly in the world for that day, and people up above stream or below stream could be fishing the same fly and having great success. But if your fly is not in the exact spot it needs to be or near that spot, you might not catch any fish. So we talk about flies. Everyone has a fly preference, but the reality is that fly needs to be in the zone. We say in the shop sometimes flies don't matter. Well, they definitely do matter. That's a bit of a, we're making a statement there, but it really is presentation first and then fly second.
Yep, absolutely. Quickly, just because I saw it come through, Andrew, any general tips re bait fish types for Ontario versus Erie versus Huron tribs? I wouldn't really say there's a huge difference. It's the same types of bait fish present in all three lakes. The one notable exception might be gobies in, say, Superior. I'm not sure if Superior has gobies, because they have actually become a huge food item for steelhead and really every game fish. But shiners, smelt, alewives, gobies certainly down here in Sculpins, that's every river.
Yep. In terms of just patterns, let's go for a variety of natural colored patterns. You don't have to go too specific.
And they all kind of look the same at the end of the day, right?
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Yeah, so you don't get too caught up in exact details and matching eye size to a fly. It's more so a bait fish pattern. A woolly bugger, to be quite honest, is going to do extremely well. You can swing a woolly bugger on a single hand or a spay rod and it will produce. And that's a bait fishy type pattern as well. Yeah. Yep,
absolutely. Cool. Okay. I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say about flies, but it's a start. What makes sense to go for next? Well, since we're just talking about swinging flies, what would you say are the ideal conditions for swinging a fly?
Ooh, geez.
I like that one because it's not saying I'm going to swing a fly every time I go out. It's, given the conditions, given my pick, what am I looking for?
That's a tough one. Geez, I wouldn't want ultra clear water. For any fishing myself, I like a bit of stain to the water itself. The water would have leveled out for a couple of days. I would want pretty stable weather conditions as well. Generally speaking, you could say that swinging flies isn't the most productive of all the methods of catching fish. So you want to stack the odds in your favor. So getting those weather conditions, getting the weather nailed down. You don't want to fish on like big weather changes, big swoops and that, more so steady conditions all across the board. And I think that's what I'm looking for, is just steadiness in that sense, and some good, not crystal clear water, but a slight stain to it. And that's what I'd be looking for myself.
Yeah, pretty simple. And again, relaying it back to temperature, swung fly means fish are going to be, to some extent, chasing down a fly. They might not have to chase it far. They might not have to chase it fast, but they're going to have to move more than they would for a nymph. So, slightly warmer conditions probably would be the other thing I'd throw in there.
So if it's fresh on the river, generally I'm not going to swing a fly. That's kind of how I look at that.
It's also just a pain because you catch ice and slush and stuff along the swing. So yeah, there's always that too. Yeah. But you can do it anytime. We'll do it through the winter. And if you're really devoted to it, you certainly can. It's just if you're trying to choose that picture perfect day, it's probably going to be a little on the warmer side out there.
Yep, and I think Patrick actually has a question if you can swing the B water of rivers as well. Like we talked about A water, B water, absolutely you can. So as well, we talk about swinging flies, just fish smaller, fish more targeted versus big, long, sweeping casts. Just get out there, even with a single hand rod or a switch rod or a spay rod in big rivers, like fish those little pockets. Just that's it. There we go.
Yeah, and it's not going to be as fun. Like I think people who are against spay fishing largely do it just because they want to cast. I'm probably guilty of that quite often too, but like the number of fish that I've hooked just with, not even like people talk about fishing the tip, fishing your sink tip just out the tip of your rod. The number of fish I've caught with just my leader at my rod, 4 or 5 feet of leader at the rod, is pretty surprising. So, yeah, don't be afraid to get right into, like, if I'm walking downstream, I may not take great joy in fishing it, but if I pass a nice little slot or a nice little pocket, as I'm walking down, I'll just sort of feed my fly through it. Sometimes you'll be surprised at the results. But a single hander will certainly give you more control and be more, if you're on a river, smaller system where the two-hander isn't needed, you'll probably be thankful to have a more maneuverable, nimble single hander in that kind of scenario. But yeah, you can totally do it. I'd also throw in, you might want to, again, if you're specifically targeting that water, change up the type of fly you fish too. So like, I'm a big fan of weightless flies or lightly weighted flies when I'm swinging to give them more movement. Heavy weighted flies, kind of like an anchor, it just doesn't move a whole lot, whereas a light fly flutters and swings. But if you toss, a light fly into a spot that's only 2 feet long or 2 feet wide, or 10 feet long, whatever, it may not be able to set up and get fishing quick enough to actually fish the spot. So that's the kind of spot where I'd pull out something. It doesn't have to be super heavy, but with some weight to get set up, and I can always plunk it through and kind of jig it through wherever it may be. That's how I've approached fishing those spots on a swing, at least. Cool. Another one for Patrick. Any advice on how to cover water or approach breaking down a run while swinging, specifically with water temp? So, I mean, we kind of cover this in fish location, I think. It's pretty much just find the fish. That's the big thing, is just find fish. So I guess the one thing you throw in there would be focus on the speed of your fly. So I don't even think of it so much as in depth, although it might be a lesser component to it, but speed is certainly a thing. So find the fish. Temperature is going to dictate where the fish are. Obviously, you have to fish where the fish are. You don't get to make the decision past that. But if the water's colder, you're going to want to fish slower. If the water is warmer, you might want more speed to induce a reactive kind of strike there. Anything else you have there, Rob?
No, that's pretty good there. I would say that once again, like, break all the rules if things aren't working. So that's one of those things that Hail Marys. So at ice cold water, I've done some, downstream bends, get the fly ripping to get that chase response out there. And those fish that are lethargic, you might get a hot fish in there, a fish that's stirred up is going to take a chance at something. So, as much as we are saying these are the general rules, again, do the Hail Marys. They definitely do work occasionally, and they can lighten up your day, but I wouldn't counter those as being like your bread and butter type stuff. Yeah. There
is also, I know one thing that we always chuckle of is there's a very well-known saying among spay anglers, guys who swing flies, the low and slow saying when it comes to targeting seal, that you want to get your fly low and you want traveling slow, which is not untrue. There's a lot of situations where that will actually work to your advantage. But I think some people really take it to heart. I know I've heard this a number of times, seen it too on a river, say like the Grand River, which anyone who's fished it knows is, not a terribly deep river in a lot of places, and certainly not a fast river. And, you'll see anglers out there and, they have this in their head and they'll be casting, putting big mends into their stuff and trying to trot their fly along as slowly as possible. And the process, the fly is just kind of dragging on the bottom and not really doing anything. And that doesn't inspire a fish to chase. It looks like a leaf fluttering down the river at best. So at the end of the day, if you're going to swing a fly, you need to move the thing. So, when I say fish it slower, I mean, you don't want it ripping past a fish 100 miles per hour in, 0-degree water. But, you got to have a little movement and don't be afraid to move the fly.
Yeah, touching on that too, say the Grand is a great example of keeping it a little higher in the water column too. If you're fishing like near Caledonia and York way downstream on the Grand, the structure down there is really pockety, and those fish will lay in the pockets. The pocket could be 2 feet deep, and what's around it is 1 foot deep or so. It's really odd geography down there, rock structure. And if your fly is deep, you're going to hang up constantly, and sometimes those windows those fish see in what's a cone looking above them, and they're blocked off with walls. If that fly is just going right over top of them, they have a very small chance of seeing this fly. So you have to keep that fly actually fairly high up in the water column, and even moving a bit faster gives them well, not faster, mind you, but it gives them something to see and chase above them. Going slow works too, but also sometimes you want to change that angle and do a downstream end to get the fly a little faster to pique their curiosity. But there are times that low low and slow, a heavy sink tip really is not the thing to use. So really pick your stuff appropriately for the conditions you're fishing, and it's not always dredging bottom. And dredging bottom, you lose more flies. That's great for us because you're buying more flies, but it's not great in terms of productivity. In that sense.
Yeah, and that doesn't, like, that's a perfect example, like you say, of where you want to think about that, but I wouldn't say that only applies to those types of scenarios. Maitland has a lot of water like that too, slots. But like you said there, a fish's vision, much like ours and anything, works in a cone, right? So you can see less close to you. I can only see about this far on either side of me. But as I get out further, I can see further out to the sides. Works the same with the fish above its head. So, very close to a fish can only see so far, and it might very easily miss a fly, but if it's actually above its head by a bit, it'll see it from further away. So yeah, I don't think you need to get right down to a fish. I know we've talked to a lot of people about this too, is that people think that a fish, especially in slightly cooler water, isn't going to want to move too far for a fly. In some cases, that very well may be true, but the actual effort required for a fish to go up in the water and go back down is pretty minimal. And so if you want to see proof of that, you can watch, like if you Google, say, YouTube videos of, say, a trout in a river just rising for a dry fly, like a resident trout, classic rise for a dry fly. You'll see there's almost no movement that it makes in the whole process. All it does is it takes its pectoral fins, the little ones on the sides, and it tilts them like rudders and forces the water under itself to propel it up toward the surface to get whatever it wants, and it just does the same process to tilt back down. They don't really have to make much use of their tails to make that move.
Yeah, whole tail flick. They're so hydrodynamic that those movements are so efficient. It's really not much effort. Chris is bang on about that. All I have to do is flick it, they come up and back down, and they're back down at the bottom. So don't think it takes a lot of effort, but you have to be convinced sometimes to move a little bit anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I would say focus on your speed, worry a little less about depth, though there are times when depth matters too. Like the one thing we haven't talked about, talking about water temperatures in this, is going back to one of those earlier slides, stocked fish versus wild fish as well. So I'd say that wild fish in general is probably going to be more willing to move a little further for a fly. Sometimes a stocked fish, you almost need to bonk it on the nose because, again, they aren't real hunters by nature. They're used to having things fed to them. So you may want to consider that to some extent, although I think water temperature still kind of rules the day.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. What else do we have here? Here's another one, sort of related, same theme. Do steelhead generally hug the bottom? You want to take that?
Yeah, no. No, they can. Active fish a lot of the time aren't nose down, buried in the sand. Like they're really, so if you're looking at, say, swinging flies, for example, you need a fish that's aggressive to take your fly, that's alert and aware and willing to cooperate. Those fish aren't nose down, hugging bottom. Those fish are essentially turned off down there. So a lot of fish are actually sitting above the bottom, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches, a foot, 2 feet, sometimes suspended in the water. They have that current rate that they need. So often folks will talk about, say, we mentioned the word dredging bottom, or they're nymphing, fishing with very heavy indicators, they're bouncing bottom, ticking bottom, constant losing flies. Well, there's a good chance you're actually fishing below those fish. And as a fish sees, they can look ahead of them and above, but they can't look down. So it's actually a good chance you're fishing really heavy rigs with like lots of split shot or tungsten beaded flies or anything that's with a lot of weight to it. You could be completely out of the fish's vision. So don't fish too deep. You'll find you'll have more success. You'll lose less flies, and you'll catch less fish if you are fishing just a little bit off bottom. That could be 6 inches. That could be 1.5 feet or 2 feet. And once again, if the fish is really inclined to take your fly, all it has to do is flick its fins, move over an inch or two, grab your fly, and come back down again. You also reduce the risk of snagging fish as well. If you're bouncing a fly off bottom through a pool of fish, you could rip a fly right through a pot of fish and foul hook a couple. If you're fishing above them, chances are you're not going to foul hook a fish as well. So that's a consideration to you, is just kind of the more ethical angling side of things for salmon and for steelhead as well.
Yeah. Now that said, I 100% agree with all that. The difference between a fish hugging bottom and being a little suspended, like say, is a foot or two. So like fish, it's the same as trout, generally speaking. They're looking for that path of least resistance. They're looking for somewhere to sit where they don't have to fight current, and water currents will almost always be slower down toward the bottom of the river. So that they do tend to trend lower than higher. But that said, you know, if you find a froggy pool or a little undercut bank where there's some soft water, you know, you can see fish. Yeah, they'll be near the surface. If they feel safe enough and they've got cover, they may not be more than a foot or two down sometimes. But probably more often than not, at least, yeah, like kind of close to bottom. So if you're nymphing, I would say, you know, you probably don't want to be like up on the surface. You do want to be down somewhere down there, but certainly not dragging bottom. I agree there.
Yep, I look at a top-down approach in terms of how I approach nymphing in water. Is I'll fish a little higher and increase my depth and get down to where those fish are. Even if I start a day swinging flies, I'll start with a fairly modest sink tip and weight, and then I'll transition to something deeper to get my fly deeper as the day progresses, knowing the fish aren't coming up to a fly quite high. So I want to get those, meet them halfway or meet them more than halfway sometimes as well. So the top-down approach is what I usually do for nymphing and swinging flies. If I'm center pinning, same thing. I'm not going to really put a heavy rig on and drop my stuff down to the bottom. It's going to be just a little bit above and sort of work myself down.
Yep, absolutely. And if there are trout anglers watching, which I know there are, that works perfectly for trout too. I do the same thing, like throw a dry fly in the mix to really think of the complete top-down package at that point.
Yep.
Just no dries for steelhead. Cool.
There's a question about if someone's trying to be dynamic, how do they know if their fly is swinging through the pool at the correct depth?
Yeah.
The fish will let you know to a degree. If you're hooking up on fish, absolutely you will find out. There is so much in terms of sink tips and fly depth to talk about. It's actually, I think I have a 45 slide page presentation called Tips on Tips, and what all the factors are that act against your sink tip and they act against your fly getting down with a sink tip on it. A big thing is how much slack you allow your presentation to have to allow that sink tip and fly to actually do sink. So it's a tough one. It's really situational in terms of the pool you're in, the conditions you're in, the line type you have, a scadget head versus a scandy head with a sink tip or a single hand line with a poly leader or a heavier sink tip too. That's a really tough one, but start a little higher, go through a pool, maybe do it again, but put on a heavier sink tip the next time. If you even add a bit more slack to your every second cast or so and get the fly deeper and try to figure out what the fish are patterning on, it's a tough one. Then yeah, as the water does cool, drop your fly down a little deeper to get slower, not necessarily deeper in that facet.
Yep.
Cool.
And yeah, I think some of that's feel too. Like you'll find, I think there is generally a happy medium when it comes to speed. You know, depth, yeah, will vary a little, and speed for sure too. Like there are times when you say fish want a fly move fast, and there are times when fish wants a fly move slow. But you know, you generally get a feel for like, okay, this is too fast, or this isn't doing anything, this is way too slow. You know, again, if you had to put a pin on it, I'd say like a slow walking speed. If you can kind of visualize your line swinging across current at least a slow walking speed, that's probably a good medium to be at least.
Yep.
You can adjust based off that.
Yeah, great. There's a comment or a question about essentially doing things different. A gentleman, Eli, asked if everyone around you is fishing eggs, you know, are you going to try a nymph? Absolutely. In terms of diversifying your presentation and your assets on the water, you can talk pretty technically about it. But if you have 2 anglers, 3 anglers, 4 anglers, I would never fish the same setup as somebody else next to me until they've proven success. So if I say Chris and I are fishing together, which doesn't happen much these days, but occasionally, if he's out there fishing with an intermediate poly leader and a small classic bait fishy type pattern, I'm going to put on a heavier sink tip and a bigger fly if I'm swinging flies. If he's nymphing and he has, like, say, that pink hare's ear, pink beak hare's ear, I'll put on an egg pattern instead and try that out. I'll try a black larger stone fly. I'll do something different just to see if we can find a pattern for those fish. In competitive angling or fly fishing, generally you fish as a team, and then you actually relay all the information back to the people who are coming into the next place behind you, and you're leaving a map for them to find success. So the person showed up and did the exact same thing. You would have a meeting at the beginning of the day saying, like, okay, everyone use the exact same setup, and then stick with it the entire day. You want to go in there with an entirely different approach, chain things up, find success, build a pattern, and then pass information of that success on to your teammates or your friend on the river as well.
Yeah, I agree. Now, that said, I think that's a good a good starting place and makes a lot of sense if you're, say, fishing with somebody who knows what they're doing, or know that the person next to you knows what they're doing. But as you say, fly pattern is only a small part of the equation, and how you fish it is probably a bigger part too. So I also, by the same token, wouldn't at all be scared to fish the exact same thing that the guy next to me is fishing if I don't think that he's fishing it well. So just because everybody's throwing an egg doesn't mean that they're fishing it well, and doesn't mean you putting on an egg won't work. So have some confidence in that, and don't be afraid to double up and go in behind somebody even using a very similar thing. Because even if they are fishing it well, they're guaranteed doing something differently than you. And it may not even be a rigging thing. You can go through the exact same run with the exact same fly, same setup, down to the tippet, and you'll have a 5-degree difference in your casting angle, and it could just be enough to seal the deal. So I agree, but also have some faith in yourself, and don't be afraid to just go with what you like.
That's a good point. Yeah, I'd say if I was fishing behind you, Chris, I wouldn't want to copy what you were doing, because you're going to fish it pretty effectively. But absolutely, change it up. So, yep.
Cool. This is a good, less fishing, more ethics-related one. When do they, being steelhead, spawn, and do you want to lay off them at that time? So steelhead don't, much like any species, don't all spawn at the same time exactly. Yes, it is absolutely a good practice not to fish for spawning fish of any species. Best to just kind of let them do what they're doing. And hearing me say that, you might say, well, why do we fish for steelhead? Aren't they spawning? Well, they're traveling to spawn, and if done properly and successfully, shouldn't really have an impact on their success rate. But yes, if a fish is sitting on a redd, on a nest that's made, and it's laying eggs, better to leave it alone. The thing though is that fish, like say, can start spawning as early as February, even January in some extreme cases. And they'll spawn all the way until mid to late May. Different fish will spawn at different times. And the way to think of that is it's basically just nature's way of diversifying its stock. So, if say a bunch of fish spawned in January, and then you had a massive flood immediately after that washed out all those eggs and killed those eggs, then at least you have some more fish coming in March, and more in April, and more in May, just to sort of balance things out. So I wouldn't say there's like a month or a week in the year where you need to stop fishing. That's the reason that we don't really have that specific closed season. Use your head. If you look up online what redds look like, there's a million photos on what they look like and how to avoid them, but basically you'll find them in shallower gravelly areas, and there'll be like a clean oval patch of gravel where you'll see there'll be a noticeably lighter area where fish have sort of fanned away all the silt and sediment and place their eggs there. So don't walk on those. And if you see fish paired up in that shallower water, that kind of thing, just steer clear of them. In the spring, just hit more pool type environments where those fish aren't going to be actively spawning, and you should be fine.
Well, a few questions about, I guess, ideal nymphing rigs and rods and things to use. We can touch on that quickly. It's pretty simple for myself anyways. I like a 10-foot 7-weight single hand rod for a lot of my nymphing, maybe a short switch rod too, like a 10-foot switch rod, or anything that's shorter distances. A really long rod, 11-foot switch rod, is kind of cumbersome to nymph with. It'll do the job. It's kind of a jack of all trades, but master of none. So I really do like a 10-foot 7-weight. It is considered like the Great Lakes steelhead rod. The other day I was fishing it's the IMX Pro from G. Loomis. Spectacular stick, actually, really designed for Great Lakes steelhead. So that's kind of my go-to is that. Some folks go heavier because they want to have a crossover salmon rod too. So an 8-weight definitely does work. Folks are getting into the Euro nymphing side of steelheading as well. And Thomas does produce a 6-weight contact. It's a rod built for Euro nymphing for steelhead that handles bigger fish, especially in heavier flows too. That's a great thing to use as well. That's kind of my go-to. For spay rods, I'll jump on that quickly. 6 or a 7-weight locally is fantastic. A 6-weight's not too light. It's a really good stick for around here. Anywhere in the for a switch rod, any switch rod length, mind you, but then for spay rods, anywhere from the 12-foot up to 13.6 is fantastic. So that's what I'd be recommending folks to look at for spay rods. And then line choice is a huge other topic, so we'll talk about that maybe some other time, but we'll just avoid the whole space setup thing. It's a big monster itself.
For sure. Yeah. And if somebody was to have one setup, I'd still say get the single hander. Don't necessarily jump into the spay thing, because the single hander is still allow you to nymph. You can swing. I remember a couple of years ago we were out drifting the Saugeen, and I just had a 10'7" weight, same rod I used for my nymphing, rigged with an OPST head, and that's one of the larger systems in Southern Ontario. I was very comfortably able to cover the entire river, or as much of it as I needed to catch fish, just with that single hander. So I don't think you need a spay rod, a single hander, and that kind of, even a 9-foot length, is going to be super, super versatile for you there.
We talk about a bit of some of the challenges of steelheading itself. There are some really good points to make about just what happens out there in terms of stress, angling pressure, and even like not finding fish sometimes. I think we talked about it briefly, Chris, about how the fish are as migratory in nature. So some days they're there, some days they're not. Chris had a phenomenal day on the river a couple days ago up on the Big Head, knocked it out of the park. Brilliant, he timed it. He timed it well. I was on the Maitland the day before that and had absolutely zero fish, 0 bumps, 0 strikes, and everyone was fishing with as well. The day before that, we had word that the same section of water that we fished was fished very well by a few anglers. They had 9 fish landed, I think, on the swing, with 11 fish hooked in total. And that one day made a massive difference in terms of productivity. We fished great water, fished it well, very similar tactics, and ended up with nothing in our hands, or to the hand anyways. So in terms of, a difficulty of these fish is that they are migratory. So when you're out there, you can use those charts to time your runs, but sometimes those fish are just on the move and are not there anymore. So don't get dissuaded. You can get out there, have a great day, fish all the water very well. There just might not be fish there that day. The next day, fish can move in or move down. One thing about fish that a lot of folks maybe aren't familiar with is that fish don't just go upriver. Sounds like a funny thing to mention, but fish also do head way back downstream as well. So you have fish heading up and downriver all through the year. A great example is there was a radio tag study done in Labrador on the Hunt River. And now this is Atlantic salmon, but there's no reason why steelhead wouldn't do this, or Great Lakes rainbow trout or steelhead. They tagged a fish that ran the river, I think 7 or 9 times, nearly the entire length of the system, through waterfalls, through crazy rapids, and then it actually ended up spawning in the estuary. So, don't think that fish are going upstream, just upstream. They're also going back down, changing spots, maybe all the way downriver, back up again. So fish are migratory. Even dead winter fish are moving around as well. So don't just think that, once they're gone, they're above and they're ahead of you. No, they could have dropped back down as well.
Yeah, maybe not so much. I don't know if you'd see too much of that en masse movement. Like if you saw a bunch of fish in one area, there's a chance that more of them than not are probably going upstream.
Yes.
Yeah, they can definitely shuffle around.
Yeah, in the spring, fish are headed downstream actually. So in that case, fish will drop back downstream, and they'll be on the reverse way out for that. Yeah. Yep,
absolutely. And temperature-wise, early season, there's actually a decent chance they could move out en masse. If there was a cold snap in late August and a bunch of fish, maybe this would be more salmon than steelhead, but they moved in. And then the next week it got really hot, they might be uncomfortable enough to actually drop out en masse. So it's possible, but yeah, it's a very fair point. These things don't sit in one spot. Like a resident trout, found fishes, same stretch of water frequently. For resident trout, you're probably, noticing that some of those larger, more recognizable fish hang out in those same spots over and over again. Steelhead don't do that. They're on the move. So tough to repeat a pattern. And so yeah, don't beat yourself up about it. I don't know any steelheader who doesn't get skunked a couple times in a season. At least, if not many, many more times. It's not the easiest game. Rewarding enough to keep doing it, but nobody's lighting it up every single time that they're out, no matter what they might say on Instagram.
Yep. Yep, absolutely. Another factor of which makes fishing difficult for steelhead is that there are a bunch of anglers on the water. We have limited sections to fish, and stress on fish is one of the biggest factors for fish not cooperating when we're fishing. Stress hormones shut fish down, whether they're bass, muskie, steelhead, rainbow trout, brown trout, brook trout. If they are stressed fish for any reason, then that's anglers walking in the river, people casting over their heads, slapping line on the water. It's, pressure changes. It's just angling pressure in general. Stress is a huge part of that. So in terms of what I do in terms of how I look to fish, I want to find the least pressured water possible. And it's sometimes that be water, because those fish have not been stressed very much. It's putting more miles on, so walking further from access points. It's drifting down a river on a Watermaster inflatable boat or drift boat to get away from the crowds to find those fish that have been less touched or less stressed as well. And in terms of even getting on the river for the day, really minimizing the disturbances that you make. So if you're wading in a river and you're hitting a big pocket of mud, kicking mud down river, that sets off a bit of a flare to fish, saying that there's something happening upstream, which could stress them as well. On really low, really slow, tanky flows that are really quiet in a lot of riffles and rapids, I'm going to keep my voice down. I think a lot of anglers underestimate the effective noise that you generate on fish. And if you're talking to a friend, hey man, how's it going? You're yelling at your buddy on the bank, what line are you using? What tip? That sound is so foreign to those fish and that environment. That sound is going through your bones and through your flesh and directly into the water. And if you've ever done that experiment where you tap a pipe in air and on the water at the same time, you're going to hear that through the water more clear and for a further distance as well. So do not underestimate the effect of your voice and noise on fish. So that when it comes to casting, you see guys out there with Skagit heads, Scandi heads, single hand rods, even guys with center pins that are skipping their floats back to you. That's skipping on the water and disturbing those pools. Guys slapping the water a few times, correcting cast. I do it, I do correct cast, and I do make some extra noise out there, but if you can, stay as quiet as you can. The old man in the boat telling a kid to be quiet, that is an absolute true thing. That noise does reverberate, it does shut fish down and can stress them out. So it's not just talking, it's everything else that's out there. So kicking mud up, kicking debris up, it's making those fish stressed in any way possible. So lots of things to think about when you are getting on the water. Just kind of minimize, be stealthy. I always look at what trout anglers do, and what we try to do on rivers is wear muted colors. We try to stay quiet. I've never fished with brown trout and yell at somebody on the bank, ask them what fly they're using in the middle of a quiet run. It's always with most delicacy, always with the most stealth as well. And we were fishing for rainbow trout, as we've been talking about. So why should that change going for this migratory version of the fish? So try to keep things as quiet as you can. A bit of advice on that one. I think it has a bigger effect than a lot of folks think about.
Yep, absolutely agree. Everything there. Cool. What else do we have here? There's a bunch still. This is an easy one. What weight rod would you recommend for steelhead? I guess actually we already touched on that. But would you change it river to river? Maybe a little bit, but not much. I think 7 weight really is sort of bread and butter for all of Ontario. I don't think you need to go bigger on any river. You could certainly fish an 8. We sell lots of 8 weights as a good versatile rod for steelhead, and that'll get you into some salmon too. 9s are overkill, but there's no harm in being a little on the heavy side. Could you step down to a 6 on some smaller rivers? Yeah, you could. If you're careful about it and confident finding fish. I think for most people, a 7 is still probably the smarter choice, frankly. But yeah, if you're on a smaller river with smaller fish, maybe you could drop down. I think a 7 is right where you want it.
Question about consuming steelhead, which we can definitely touch on.
Yep.
So I'm a catch release angler for steelhead. I keep very few fish in a year, just kind of not in my ballpark of stuff that I do. It's completely within your ability to retain steelhead if you do look at the regulations. And if you do by chance kill a fish as you're catching it, it is your legal responsibility to retain that fish and make sure that it gets consumed in some way, given to somebody or consumed yourself. So it's actually maybe something we need to touch on for that aspect, of it is your legal duty to not let the flesh go to waste.
Unless it is a catch and release area, in which case, unfortunately, you're just not allowed.
That is correct. Yeah. So even if you do kill the fish by accident, you have to leave that fish where it is and let it float downriver or be a part of nature. So don't remove it in that context. There's
only maybe 2-3 areas in Southern Ontario where that's a thing, though. So yeah, in general, if something unfortunate happens, just take the fish.
Yeah, and that can happen through all methods of angling too, whether it's fishing with fly or gear. I've seen a couple of steelhead be hooked deeply and bled out on the spot with a single hook on a spay fly. So it happens. Just it's the nature of what we do as we're out there fishing. So in terms of before you eat any fish, I would highly recommend you look at the Guide to Eating Sport Fish in Ontario. It will give you the healthy limits of fish to consume. There are fish species which they recommend eating 0 fish in terms of proportions or very small amounts. If you are a woman of childbearing age, if you're a child, they recommend, or you have I think you're compromised in some sort of health facets, they recommend you eat no fish in some species. So just be very mindful of that. It's not about getting sick today. It's about the long-term effect of heavy metal poisoning, PCBs and mercury and things like that as well. So look at the regulations, make sure you understand them, then reference this guide to eating sport fish. It's very Googleable. You can find it online. Just put in Google, it'll pop up, the Guide to Eating Sport Fish in Ontario. And then just do your duty and due diligence on that as well.
And don't assume that just because you're allowed to keep those fish that they line up with that guide either. Strangely, they are not at all correlated.
Yeah, great examples. If you keep a Pacific salmon and it's maybe, let's say, 15 to 20 pounds, once you do harvest the meat off that, you're losing about 2/3 of flesh. Sorry, losing the guts, the bones, and the skin as well. But you're left with you're left with too much meat to safely consume within a year for a single fish. So that's a huge red flag.
To be wrong, but I think it's 5 per person is the possession.
Yeah, exactly. So imagine if you keep 5 fish, you have crazy amounts of contaminated flesh what are you going to do with it? If you're going to feed it to people as well, that's a big issue too. So if you are going to feed people fish, let them know what the guideline is to make sure they're informed. Just don't go ahead and feed people stuff that could be potentially toxic for them down the road. So just please be mindful of that.
Yep. And also, we always like to throw out there as part of the reason that we're mainly catch and release ourselves. Not that we would ever judge anyone for keeping fish, but the other thing that we have to realize is that I think most of us live in a very densely populated area. And as we've said, we do have some stocked fish in some rivers, but a lot of these things are naturally reproducing at this point, not supplemented, or at least not very much with stocked fish. And so if everyone does keep keep a fish or 2 here and there, that can have a big compounding effect really quickly. So do what you're legally entitled to do, but it may be worth thinking about, where you're going to do this. Is it a stocked river? Is it a wild river? And think about the amount of pressure that water sees too. Some rivers just don't have great runs of fish these days, and they really can't sustain a whole lot of that. Our regulations, Ontario has decent regulations for protecting our fish. They aren't nearly as fine-tuned as they could be for a lot of rivers. And we tend to paint Ontario in really broad strokes. Take Zone 16. It's the entirety of southwestern Ontario. It's dozens of rivers, which are all very unique in their own ways. So, and this isn't exactly easy info to find. Sometimes it's not at all available if there aren't fish counts being done. But some rivers are just hit harder, and you'll recognize that pretty easily. And so you may want to pick and choose where you would potentially keep a fish from. Just from ethics perspective there.
Yep. So if anyone has more questions, let's get them in the...
I do have a couple here real quick.
Oh, yeah. So I want to promise we get some more on the go so we can keep going here. Right on.
Not quite steelhead related, but best river for landlocked Atlantics in Ontario. It's got to be the Sioux.
Yeah, 1000%. Those fish are they hit the rapids. It's known for that, and they're plentiful up there. So I wouldn't recommend anyone go chase Atlantic salmon in any other river in Ontario because there's so few in terms of numbers, extremely few. The Credit River, I think this year just got a run of just over 50 fish. Maybe it's more than that, but it's way under 100. And if you factor in fish mortality, when you do even with the best catch and release, you can make a pretty big impact on those fish just catching one. So really, I would say don't target them if you can. here now, wait the population does grow if it does grow, and then put time in it that way. But for Ontario, this like Sault Ste. Marie, the Sioux Rapids, there's great guides up there. John Giuliani is he's legendary up there, and a bunch of other guides as well. So I'd recommend that's where you go. Leave the other ones that are just kind of getting going. That program has not seen a lot of success, so let's not hamper it. Let's just let it ride out and see what happens there.
Yep, they're cool bycatch.
Yep.
So I mean, enjoy the catching of one if you're so lucky. But yeah, I would agree. Probably not the best idea to be specifically targeting them. There is technically a season now for them, where in the past it was, all Atlantics must be immediately released. You'll see now in most places that there is a possession limit listed of 0, which doesn't sound any different. But what it means is that there's an actual season where you're allowed to target them. The reason, to the best of our knowledge, that was put in place is because it was almost sort of a taboo thing to even talk about catching an Atlantic in the past. You couldn't take a photo of it to prove that it wasn't an Atlantic. And so the MNR wasn't getting the feedback that they needed to verify how successful the program was. And so by introducing the 0 possession limit, people can now document their catches and sort of prove or disprove the success of the program. It's not really to introduce a new angling opportunity where we can specifically target them, if that makes sense.
Cool. Right on. Jumping off to another gear question is that Brian Teal asked for any recommendation on sort of staving off guide or ice under guides online. Stanley Ice Off Paste. By chance, I have a pack right beside me. Phenomenal product. Eric at the shop. I think anyone's ever sold more of this than him. He's a big advocate of it. It's a fantastic product. So there you go. That's a great one. Folks have used things like PAM in the past and different sprays and all that. But this is an eco-friendly option. If you're putting PAM and oils into the water, not great. So, Loon is a very eco-friendly company, great product. So it's Stanley's Ice Off Paste. There you go. Nice little plug.
It's a good one. Cool.
Great question about targeting steelhead during the salmon run. That's a great topic. Mind water temperatures, that's one factor of that too. So make sure the water is cool enough to ethically target those fish. And then what's going to happen to those fish? Steelhead will most likely be behind those salmon. So if salmon are spawning in the shallower areas, those will be just over the lips in the pools, gobbling up eggs. So if someone said, Rob, go out and catch a steelhead during salmon season, I'm going to focus my time behind those salmon. I think maybe the tailouts of those runs where the fish are, those big salmon can push other smaller fish out. So those tailouts work pretty well for me. If those fish are spawning in a shallow area, then right below those, right behind those, you'll find those drops. Those steelhead will be sitting there just gorging on eggs as they float downstream.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. Tips for fighting and landing a steelhead. Somebody's never caught one.
Ooh, okay. Have a friend with you. That's a big one. It's tough. If you have a 10-foot rod or 9-foot rod, or if you have a float rod with you that's maybe 13 feet long, that's a pretty awkward arm stretch. What you don't want to do is drag that fish onto the bank or into shallow water. We'll touch on some catch and release ethics and process here. A fish can get a concussion. It's one of those odd things you don't think about, but in a river or water situation, steelhead don't feel the weight of their body. They're not thrashing around, hitting land. But if you do beach a fish, it's a very good chance it can concuss itself. It'll swim away, but then actually die of a TBI very shortly afterwards, a traumatic brain injury shortly afterwards. These are fish. The name steelhead doesn't mean they have like iron helmets on. These things are actually like very, very sensitive fish to handling. Dragging a fish onto the bank is terrible, because you're removing the fish slime as well. That slime is the biobarrier, which keeps infection away from the fish. So please do not beach those fish. If it is a water landing job, make sure the water is at least a foot deeper. So if it does try to thrash, it's not going to hit itself. It's tough. We want to be able to land those fish, remove the hooks, maybe get a photo for ourselves, and then put it back in the water. But we have to make sure we're doing it as friendly as we can to make sure the fish does survive. As if you are practicing catch and release. Even if you are not practicing catch and release and you are keeping a fish, be mindful that a fish can come dislodge from your hook and swim away, which could then suffer effects down the road as well. So regardless if you are releasing or keeping, make sure that fish is handled as best as you can. And that's a deep water land. Keep it in the water. And then if you are by yourself, a long handled net goes a long way. Otherwise, a trick that I learned actually from Ed Ward, one of his videos, is that when he does as he strips out a bunch of line below his pinched line. So he has a big loop of line. A fish comes in close. He's lifting his rod, pulling it back, walking the fish back. As the fish is pretty relaxed and not fighting anymore, he'll release that line. So he has a ton of slack, run forward, and then grab the tail of the fish. It's a bit of a ballet out there, especially in water flow, slippy conditions, but I find that's the best way for me to cause the least amount of damage to that fish when trying to land it. So be mindful of that. Tough one.
Yeah. I'll even do that nymphing. Like I'll leader a fish if I feel I can. Ideally, out of net, but yeah, it is a good one. From Robbie here. Sometimes when I'm quickly picking up line, the line wraps around the tip, the fish gets off and he tips. So I guess he's having fish sort of maybe run at him, or he's trying to pick up line, and that slack is just wrapping around the tip. It's a tricky one. If that's consistently happening, that it shouldn't be. I don't have much, quite frankly, but strip faster, I guess.
Also, maybe it's a line twist issue in there as well. If you have slack and that line is kind of twisting around, so twist involved. So maybe try straightening out your line, just let it float down in a very steady current on a river and let it just unravel on itself, and then it should hopefully do less of that gripping onto your tip there. Yeah.
Tough to say without seeing it though. General rules on length of sink tip to use. This would be a swinging specific question, obviously. I think that very largely depends on your specific line setup, which, as we said, we're not really getting into tonight just because it's going to be so different for everybody. So if you want to get in touch with us at the shop on that one, happy to help. Sink tips could be anywhere from 2 feet to 15 feet in general. So it very dependent on the type of rod set that you're going to cast, but generally a longer sink tip will have more of an effect on your fly. Short ones might be better suited to like pocket water, where you don't want your line wrapping around boulders and stuff, but you want to swing in behind pockets. So you can think of the type of water that you're fishing to a certain extent like that, but it really boils down, I think, to your rod setup there. This was a good one actually from Rob. I'm sorry we didn't get to it quicker. How do you balance moving to find fish versus changing your setup several times in a whole run? So should you be running and gunning constantly, or should you really be combing that water over? I think it probably depends on factors like time of year and your confidence in the river, right? And if you're seeing fish, if there's signs of fish. So I think early season, typically you see a lot more of the scenario where fish start really firing through very quickly through a river. Sort of like Rob's scenario last week on the Maitland, where they were, there one day, gone the next. And so you can maybe a little bit more reliably say, the fish are probably on the move. And so I'd be more tempted in that case, at least, to maybe do a little more run and gun, versus you get to say late fall or certainly spring, where you can with almost certainty say there is a fish in this pool, or at least one, if not many. So I think that that's a huge factor, is time of year, water conditions. So if you have low water, fish get penned in. High water, they have the freedom to move around. So if the water's up, they aren't hemmed in any one particular area. That's their chance to boogie up a river. It's an open highway, versus if the water comes down, they could get trapped in pools and things, and those are where they're going to feel safest too. So you still have to figure out how high up on the river they managed to get before it got low. But if you have some degree of certainty, I'd be much more tempted to really pick it over at that point. And that's about it. Most water conditions is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's a great tip. That's fantastic. Great advice there. One of my friends and Chris knows him quite well too, is he's one of the best steelheaders I know, hands down. And he is a runner and gunner. The Grand, for example, he has been on the river for 30 years, and he's maybe longer actually, just picked out exact spots of where to fish. And he'll go through a spot, he'll know the exact 15-foot stretch or 20 or 50-foot stretch of river that's going to hold fish. He'll hit that once, he'll jump somewhere else, hit another spot, come back to that spot maybe a few hours later, knowing a fish may have circulated through or woken up, or water temps change and things have changed there. So don't be stuck into fishing, an entire run all the way through or an entire section of river. Maybe circulate back up again and do that. So don't be stuck in just hitting that one spot, fishing it too deeply. It is a balance of knowing the conditions, knowing that area, water temp fluctuations, like middle of the winter, The first thing in the morning, the water would be extremely cold. 3 hours in, you might get a 1 degree bump or 2 degree bump. That changes that pool. So head back there and do it again. So it's a tough one. So run and gun is great, but also don't just burn through water too quickly as well. So fish it well, and then just get to know your systems and get to know your spots and target those sometimes. Yeah,
absolutely. And don't discount the fact that water can change through a day too. So take the lower beaver, and there's probably not a ton of people who love fishing that water because it gets insanely crowded. But you're talking about Thornbury or Tanglebury if you fish it, and it's this very short stretch of water below a dam right at the mouth of the river. And what happens, and there's other rivers that have a similar effect, even Niagara to a certain extent, although it may not create quite the same effect, is the dam levels will fluctuate through the day. And so it's almost like you get a bump of rain every couple hours. And you'll have this, for whatever reason, this little surge of water that'll come through the river, and that'll draw fish in. And so even if you're fishing the same run for a number of hours, it could suddenly have fish where it didn't 5 minutes ago. Of course, fish are moving upstream a lot of the time, constantly. And so that could happen anytime, but there are other effects that can suddenly spur a fish to start moving. That could be light levels, that could be a temperature change, like Rob says, that could be a rise in water from somewhere too. So rivers aren't static, fish aren't static. Don't be afraid to fish spots over at different points of the day. It could be a little different for you.
A good question from Brian on terms of the tippet you want to use or a terminal tackle. If I'm going to be fishing with a indicator rig, 6 pound is kind of where I want to be. I don't want to go much lighter than that. Fish can get quite big. That's abrasion resistance as well. If I'm swinging flies, I'll be 8 pound, 10 pound, and 12 pound. Ideally, in terms of my terminal end, sometimes I'll build a leader to turn a fly over. My terminal end is going to be that 8. 10 or 12 pound, with 6 pound be the lightest I want to go for my steelheading for nymphing.
Yep, I agree. Pretty easy there. And base that on the river that you're fishing too. I think you can generally get away with slightly heavier tippets in big water. So if you're fishing the Niagara, I wouldn't even be scared to nymph with 8 or even maybe 10 pound line, because the currents are so big. Fish may not be quite so picky, but if you're on Wilmot Creek, really slow, oftentimes very clear, sometimes it is very necessary to go light. So use what you can. Obviously, stronger is nice for fighting fish, but sometimes it doesn't quite cut it, obviously, for presentation.
And Chris, are you talking about the visibility of the taper of the leader itself, or are you talking about the action of the fly?
Both. I think we're kidding ourselves if, when we're talking about 6 pound line and heavier, the fish can't see it. I think generally they can. Now, there are certain lines that would definitely be less visible than others in certain water types. But I think to some extent, even the clearest fluorocarbon 6 pound, a fish is probably going to see to some extent. Whether or not they care is a very different matter. But I think that the action that you get on a fly, the sink rate if you're swinging, that makes a huge difference. And I think that's truly where things, where that tipping point is when you're talking about diameters, is you're talking about how the fly presents, not what everyone thinks, do the fish see it. So if you're fishing a small fly and you're fishing this really wiry line, you can imagine it's not going to allow it to drift freely in a river. Or if you're talking about swinging, if you have a really thick tippet, it's not going to cut through the water in the same way. The extra diameter, small as it may seem, is actually going to displace more water. It's not going to sink so easily. So yeah, absolutely, it affects things there, for sure, on both fronts. And I think it's just about all the questions I see here.
Yeah, that's a lot there. So any closing points, Chris? Any other questions, drop them in there, but we may wrap things up very soon. But any closing points, Chris?
There was one last question from Matt. Tapered leader or no for steelhead? Depends on the type of fishing you're doing, the type of rig that you're fishing. Generally, tapered leader for most things. So if you're nymphing, I do like a tapered leader, although you can use, you can make a leader out of, say, a heavy butt material and then tip it. Generally, I like a tapered leader just to turn over all that weight and stuff. Swinging, a lot of folks will just go straight level line. I actually really like a tapered leader. Gets me more consistent turnover. I generally, personally, I fish a lot like full sink heads where they're going to get the fly in regardless. I don't need that short stretch of leader. I'd rather have my fly distance from the tip to get me more movement and get consistent turnover. So you can play around with both. Again, no rules in this stuff. Probably more cases than not a tapered leader, but it depends on your rig.
You're talking about knots, using a loop knot or I guess a direct connection or like a tight knot, if you want to call it that. I tend to use a loop knot for swinging flies to allow my fly to move and undulate and move more. There's no reason why you couldn't use a loop knot, like a very small micro loop knot on a nymph or an egg pattern. Like there's no reason to not. You could. I've never done it. I don't know why I've not done it actually, but yeah.
I'm personally not of the mind it actually makes much difference. That's me. I don't know. But yeah, I think you'll still get plenty of movement with the right tippet size. Yep. Of a direct knot there. But yeah, I like looping a fly too when it comes to swinging.
Yeah, stripping streamers too, and if you're fishing a heavier fly,
it makes a big difference for sure.
If you're fishing a heavier fly and want to get down, the angle that fly can actually descend at makes a big difference too. Allows it to hinge and point down versus having to float down and with more resistance. So if you have like say a dumbbell eye intruder, if you have a big cone head, something that's going to really hinge and just drop and get down to a deeper depth.
Yep. Yeah. Closing remarks. Get out and fish. I think, this week is probably, like I say again, be the big kickoff for the season, just with the amount of water that we've seen over the last week and the temperatures finally getting down to fall-like levels. So yeah, use those charts and get out there and let us know how you do. And of course, if you need any specific advice on rigs or anything for your own needs or want to talk more about anything or come up with a question next hour, you can reach us at the shop there. But that's all I got.
Well, great. I think one thing actually we didn't do, Chris, is Google Earth or Google Maps or Apple Maps.
It's true. We didn't talk about how to approach a new river. I mean, I think we gave enough info on types of water that you're searching for.
Yeah, so we can quickly touch on without, we might not go into the screens, but quickly just, if you do go into Apple Maps or Google Maps, go to the satellite view and check rivers out and build yourself a database of all the rivers when the water is low and clear, and you can see the structure down there. So right now, if you Google Caledonia on the Grand River, it's extremely clear where all the pockets are, and all the deep water is where you want to fish.
I think, sorry, Rob, I think those Apple Maps we were looking at that had better imagery.
Those Apple Maps, yeah. So go between Apple Maps and Google Maps. You'll find that there's a difference in terms of the satellite imagery and the times. Depends on when they took the photo, essentially. And then to build yourself a database of those, because that rivers do change a bit, but for the most part, those big pools will still be there. A log may move, a branch may move, a rock may move, but those big spots are going to be there. So if you can build yourself a database of those, and before you get to the river, look at those and even reference them to where you're standing in the river and where that slot may be, with a bit of stained water, the Grand being a nondescript river as well in terms of the structure down there, you know where to cast at that point. So one last tip on that, we didn't get to it too much, but we could have gone, we'll do it again at some point. I would say that my closing remarks is would be, yeah, same as Chris, get on the river and fish. Like there's no better time. The temperature is great for us to be out there right now too. It's not -10. It's not blowing snow sideways. It's not sleeting and hailing. It's really beautiful to be out there. It's gorgeous out there. So get out there and fish. Even a slow day of fishing is spectacular. So get out there and have fun. Fish well, make sure you're covering water well. Have confidence, but have fun. Don't get frustrated. These are migratory fish. They may not be there. And then just get along. Like one of the things we find in steelhead season is a lot of folks will kind of get a little touchy in terms of where to fish, what to fish, proximity to others. If someone comes a little close to you, they low hole you, they call it, just have a conversation with them and say, hey man, I was fishing here. Do you mind moving on? Like I'll be done here in a second or two. Or hey, or even if you want to fish somewhere, ask them like, hey, can I join in the pool and fish here as well? And just have a conversation. Just have a nice, nice experience out there and communicate what you want to do. Explore new water, get out there, use satellite imagery, use those flow charts, use them to find rivers. It's absolutely doable. I live near the Humber River, and I would say 98% of the anglers stick to the old mill under the bridge there. There is an entire expanse of water up to the 403, 407 currently. Check the regs. But you could fish above Eglinton, you could fish above Lawrence. There's a ton of water, so why pile up at this exact same spot? Go explore, fish in that river, for example, go all the way up to Woodridge. That's fantastic. So why aren't we fishing that? So move away from folks, get some shoulder room, get some elbow room, and go and have a great time out there. The Dawn, people hate hearing this from us because the folks who know about the Dawn don't want to be told, but it's in our backyard. Go fish it. Every little creek out there. Go have fun. Explore. Get out of your comfort zone with rivers. Have fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well said, for sure.
All right.
All about fire is really the only way to do it. So just get out there and have at it.
That's it. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks for everyone for tuning in. I think it sounds like we could even do a couple spin-offs on this, on more specific topics. So I'm sure we'll have lots to revisit through the winter here. Based on the interest here, I'm sure we will.
Oh yeah, and also I think James' note there is if you're on the river, pick up the trash behind you. Pick up your trash, and if you can't clean others up as well, that's a great thing to do out there as well. Why not, guys? Have fun.
Absolutely. Cool.
All right.
All right. Well, have a good night all, and we'll see you in the shop soon enough.
All right. Take care, everyone.